difficult for her and the rest of the Burkians to fall back to sleep after witnessing the birth of the Blood Eagle. Stoic's words also didn't help them to rest. Most of them imagined themselves going through the same thing as the man they've briefly shared the prison with. Astrid trembled slightly at the picture that has appeared in her mind, her kneeling, with Hiccup standing behind her, opening her back and removing her ribs. During the last night, for the first time in her life, Astrid was terrified of Stoic's son. And she could tell that others were as well. She looked up, even though her mind was telling her not to do that. But still, she had found herself observing the corpse that was spread between two trees, just at the entrance to the forest. It was swaying slightly, moved by the gentle wind, hovering above them as if that man wanted to remind them what fate awaited for those who were Rideri's enemies. Astrid forced herself to look away and focus back on what she was doing. Truth be told, there weren't many repairs to do. Some of the houses had a few holes in them, while a few were missing a wall or even a roof, but those were rare. They've also managed to accelerate their progress by sharing different tasks amongst themselves. She, Rough Nut, and Gobber were responsible for wood processing and turning the tree trunks into planks. Fishlegs and Tough Nut were supplying them with the necessary material while Stoic and Snotlout were fixing the houses. Astrid felt bad for Berk's blacksmith. Even though he tried not to show it, it was obvious that his wounds still hurt him. He has never shown it during the battles, though. Astrid could only guess that it was due to the rush of adrenaline that was nullifying the pain. This sight made her forget all the fear of Hiccup she had felt and allowed hatred to take its place. She couldn't believe that it was the same man she knew years ago. Of course, Astrid was aware that he had matured, just like the rest of them, but she still couldn't believe that he would allow the person who was so close to him to suffer like that. Her anger caused her blood to boil, and she wondered what she would do if she met Hiccup during the day. As if someone was listening to her thoughts, the morning air was filled with an unmistakable sound of the night fury. Instinctively, she looked upwards, feeling her heartbeat becoming a little quicker. Her friends did the same, noticing the black shape in the sky. Even from afar, they've noticed that someone was on the dragon's back. Hiccup, she realized, and her anger returned to her with full strength. Having no other way of taking it out, she focused back on working on the tree trunk. But every now and then, she would find herself gazing curiously at the dragon and its rider. Dozens of questions were flashing through her mind, and she couldn't find an answer to either of them. The one that appeared in her head most often was, where were they going? Her eyes widened in shock after a few seconds of observing Hiccup and the night fury. One moment they were gliding through the sky, just below the layer of clouds, and in the next, the man was falling towards the cold waters of the sea. The dragon was following his rider, but it did not attempt to catch him. She felt her throat tightening. The rest of the Burkians were also watching it with wide eyes. When it seemed like there was no possible way for Hiccup to avoid a deadly meeting with the sea, the night fury has somehow appeared between its rider and the waters, allowing the man to land gracefully on its back. The duo glided effortless just above the waves. It made her remember her first and only flight with Hiccup when he had kidnapped her. She wondered if anything had changed since then when it came to flying. She could still remember the first time she had touched the clouds, something no one else from Berk could praise themselves with. Astrid's head was filled with questions if they still were just as cold as she recalled. And if they still were filled with small droplets of water. Wow, she heard Rough Nut murmur behind her. No matter what she felt towards Hiccup at that moment, she had to agree with her friend. It was possibly the only proper comment at what they have seen. They were broken out of the stasis after one of the guards ordered them to continue their work. It wasn't long before Hiccup and the Night Fury landed near them. Astrid had to admit that Hiccup looked intimidating on the back of the unholy offspring of lightning and death itself. She noticed that her friends were observing the black creature and its rider with wide eyes, and that's when she realized that it was the first time they were seeing the Night Fury during the day. Hiccup dismounted the dragon and exchanged a few words with the guard named Steinar. Astrid noticed how he was petting the dragon with his hand without even looking at it. It was surprising, to say the least, to see someone with their back turned towards the creature without being afraid of any form of aggression from its side. The Night Fury seemed not to pay attention to its rider, though, instead focused on the group of Burkians. Astrid glanced at her chief, who was standing a few steps away from her. He was looking at the leader of Driki with a mixture of hatred and fear in his eyes. She couldn't blame him, though. If she didn't know that the Night Fury's rider was Hiccup, she would have had a similar expression. She found herself looking back at the black dragon, only to see something strange. Astrid was used to looking into the eyes of the creatures she had slain during her life, and they've always been filled with aggression and seemingly unquenchable bloodlust. But all she had found in the Night Fury's eyes was curiosity, if dragons were capable of showing it. Toothless was examining her carefully, spinning his head around occasionally. Astrid wondered for a brief moment if the dragon recognized her. She doubted it, of course, remembering that the Night Fury hadn't seen her for the past 10 years. But still, it was odd seeing the dragon be so curious about her. Her wondering had been stopped abruptly when Hiccup urged Toothless to follow him. Astrid watched for a few seconds where they were heading. She was surprised to see that their destination was the corpse that had been spread between 2 trees the previous night. She watched carefully as Hiccup was examining the dead body. She was surprised when she saw him cutting down the ropes that were holding the lifeless man. Astrid observed Hiccup as he picked up the man's corpse and disappeared in the forest, consumed by the trees that were growing so close to each other. His Night Fury was following his every step. Judging by the sun's position in the sky, Astrid could only guess how much time had passed since their brief encounter with Hiccup. The young shield maiden estimated that the Driki's chief had been in the woods for a few hours at least. The man's corpse wasn't with him anymore, though. After a brief moment, Astrid had noticed a shovel in the young chief's hand. It took her a few seconds to realize what it meant. Hiccup had buried the man he had executed the previous night. Astrid had to admit that she was surprised after noticing that Hiccup was approaching them. Since the Burkians' encounter with him in the Driki's Great Hall, they have seen him only once, not counting the birth of the Blood Eagle, and only for a short moment. She expected that he would return to his house, which he seemed not to leave at all. Instinctively, Astrid looked around, attempting to locate the little girl that had to be Hiccup's daughter. To her surprise, she hadn't found her. That was strange. From their brief meetings with the young chief, the shield maiden deducted that he and the child were inseparable. But it wasn't the case at that moment. The little girl was nowhere to be found. Astrid could only speculate that it was due to an early hour, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Focused on her work, the young shield maiden has managed to see with the corner of her eye that Hiccup was indeed approaching them, getting closer and closer with each step he took. She breathed heavily after placing yet another log on the rack. Her breath turned into vapor instantly. Underscore 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 underscore. Hiccup was nervous if the accelerated beating of his heart was any indication. He wasn't sure why he was approaching the group of the hooligans that were accompanied by a few of the guards. The only comfort he got was from Toothless, who was walking next to him, allowing the young man to feel the dragon's presence. His heart was aching after seeing Stoic and Gobber forcing themselves with the task he had given them. Despite his past with the chief of Berk, Hiccup still saw him as a father and the old blacksmith as one of his rare friends. He rarely spoke about it, but most of his decisions as the chief of Driki were made based on what he had learned from his father. And so, he couldn't stop his legs from carrying him to the group of people that were his prisoners. Hiccup quickly examined his surroundings, noticing that the Burkians have divided various tasks between themselves, which made them work more efficiently. Hiccup was sure that it was because of his father's idea, he would always come up with the best plan for the worst situation. Stoic, Hiccup called out, observing the huge man who was standing on the ladder. The chief of Berk has acknowledged him with a cold look that sent shivers down the young man's spine. I see that the reparations are going nicely, he commented, unsure of what he should say. His father only huffed at that, turning back his gaze from him. Hiccup closed his eyes, cursing himself quietly. He might have been the infamous Dragon Master, but he wasn't an expert in subtlety. It was one of the few things that have never changed for the past few years. If you keep up your current pace, you might even finish before the Snoggletog, Hiccup added, doing his best to sound as friendly as possible. Stoic huffed again at his words, causing his son to sigh heavily. The chief of Berk was going down the ladder. He had finished placing another plank in the place of the missing one. Look, we might not have started in the best way possible, but... What do you want? Stoic growled at him, clearly annoyed. It might have been a decade, but Hiccup would always recognize that tone. He had heard it so many times when he was younger, and each time his father used it, it had been directed at him. Stoic's response has caused Steinar and the other guards to place their hands on their weapons instinctively. Hiccup stopped them from interfering with a small shake of his head. He knew his father well enough to be sure that he wouldn't try anything stupid in the middle of the tribe that considered them their enemies. As I was saying, Hiccup replied, trying to sound unaffected by Stoic's words. We might not have started in the best way possible. I want you to know that my behavior 2 days ago had been caused by some unpleasant situations that took place not so long ago, he said, doing his best to be as diplomatic as he possibly could. I wasn't thinking clearly back then, and if you had shown up a few days later, my reaction could have been different. You must understand that we're still recovering from a recent war with the man you have seen during this night, he said, observing his father carefully. And what of it? Stoic asked him, clearly annoyed by Hiccup's presence. The young chief would have laughed at the irony of the situation in other circumstances. Without knowing it, Stoic was treating him in the exact same way as he had done during his years as a child. The point is, Hiccup continued, trying not to show how unsure he was. I want to apologize for what I've done, he said, earning himself a surprised look from the man he was talking to. You have indeed attacked us, but you were desperate. I understand that I'm also guilty of making decisions while being clouded by my emotions. If you regret that, Stoic replied without looking at him. The huge man was still focused on his task at hand. Then you will release us. I cannot do that, Stoic Hiccup replied immediately. As a chief, I cannot go back on my word. If the circumstances were any different, I would have done it, believe me. And why should I believe a dragon lover? Stoic queried, still refusing to look at him. Because I don't want us to be enemies, he replied, carefully wondering on each word he was about to say. I hope that, as a chief, you'll understand my motives and my actions at some point. And I have to say that I hope that after all of this is done, we will go in our separate ways as friends. Or allies at least, he offered. Stoic huffed at that again, finally looking at the chief of Driki. I knew you had something wrong with that head of yours, but still, you've managed to exceed my expectations, he replied. Hiccup had easily recognized his tone, knowing that his father was barely keeping his anger under control. We don't make friends with dragons, and I'm not going to form an alliance with a bunch of traitors like you. And if Berk survives the winter, I can assure you that we won't forget our time spent here. I don't think it's wise for you to threaten me in my own home, Hiccup countered, crossing his arms on his chest. Not to mention it's impolite, he added with a small smirk. I don't make threats, boy, Stoic countered, shaking slightly due to the pent-up anger. I make promises. So do I, Hiccup replied, straightening himself to try to reach his father's height. He still lacked a few centimeters. And I'm not a boy, Stoic, he added, looking him straight in the eyes, even though his hood was hiding most of his face from his father. I'm a man and a chief. And I can assure you that I'm able to do anything to protect my family and my friends from everything I consider to be a threat, he said. Hiccup's tone lacked its previous joyfulness and sarcasm. And you've seen a proof of that during the night, he finished, smirking after seeing that Stoic took a small step backward. That smirk has hidden Hiccup's real emotions. He was almost disgusted with himself for how he talked to his father. But then, he recalled Iret's words from the feast. Fear was his only tool, for now, at least, of making sure that his village was safe. The chief of Berk looked behind Hiccup's shoulder at the spot where Dagur used to hang. The snow has almost entirely covered the red spot that remained after the puddle of blood. I'm sure you've heard about Dagur the Deranged and his conquest of the archipelago, am I correct? Hiccup asked him, receiving a small confirmative nod from Stoic. That man had made a mistake of underestimating me, which cost him greatly. You will do well to remember what happened to him if you decide to attack us in the future. Stoic had no answer for that. He saw the reason behind Rideri's words, but it didn't mean he had to like them. Truth be told, if they were in any other village, a normal one, that is, he would be surprised to receive an offer of alliance or even friendship from their chief. It's pointless to add that he would gladly accept that proposition without having second thoughts about it. He knew the laws of the archipelago well after all, he wasn't one of the best chiefs without a reason. He knew that if the situation was reversed, Stoic would have most likely executed the young chief. Riddery had no reason to spare them, and yet he had done that. Some could argue that it was a sign of weakness, cowardice, but Stoic thought otherwise. Sometimes it required more courage to spare someone's life instead of taking it. And so, the giant man could only stare at his son in silence. "I don't want us to be enemies," Stoic Hiccup repeated. "But in the end, it will be your decision," he finished and left the chief of Berk to consider his words. Only then, when he wasn't completely focused on his father, Hiccup had noticed that their small conversation attracted the attention of the other hooligans, except for Fishlegs and Tough Nut who were in the forest. Hiccup felt a small pang in his heart. It had been 10 years, but these were the people he had grown up with, even if they weren't his closest friends. That feeling intensified when he looked at Gobber. Hiccup gasped silently. The old blacksmith was like a second father to him when he was younger. It pained him to see his mentor in such a state. The last decade had certainly not been an easy one for him. He was slouching even more than he remembered, and his walk was much heavier as well. Each step he took was followed by a small groan. His stumps were even more painful than they used to be, or that was Hiccup's guess at least. And then there was Astrid. In opposite to her companions, the young shield maiden was doing her best to ignore him, refusing to look at him as much as she could. But it still wasn't enough to stop her from gazing at him from time to time, even if only with the corner of her eye. And yet, during those quick glances, Hiccup has managed to see the same fear he had seen in her eyes during the night, but this time it was also mixed with hatred. He stopped himself from snorting in the last second possible. He had grown used to seeing that emotion in the eyes of those who were looking at him. "Are you okay?" Hiccup asked Gobber. He cleared his throat a little, suddenly feeling terribly thirsty. The old blacksmith had only raised his head slightly after hearing his question, though he did not answer. He let out only a subtle groan. "I've asked if you are okay," he repeated, trying to sound as friendly as he possibly could. "Of course he's not okay. Are you blind?" Hiccup received a reply, but it didn't come from Gobber. He, the hooligans, and even some of the villagers who were around turned their heads to look at the person who had said those words. It was Astrid. "Of course it was Astrid," Hiccup commented, smirking slightly. There was no trace of fear in her eyes anymore, only anger. The young blonde was watching him with a hateful expression, looking around from time to time, seeing the attention she had gathered on herself. That didn't stop her from judging him with her eyes, though. "I'm not blind," Hiccup countered, doing his best not to let his voice fail him at that moment. One of his cheeks suddenly felt very hot, reminding him of his last night on Berk. If he focused enough, he could still feel her lips on his skin. For a brief moment, he wondered if they were still as soft as he remembered. "And why do you care, dragon lover?" Gobber asked him, once again grunting heavily. "Don't pretend you care for my well-being, because I won't believe any of those lies," he spat at him. Although he refused to show it, Hiccup once again felt a pang in his heart. Did they really hate him so much? No, he answered himself. They hate Riddery. But it didn't comfort him in any way, though. Hiccup and Riddery were the exact same person, one couldn't exist without the other. But still, it didn't stop him from wondering if they would harbor the same cold feelings towards him if they knew. For a split second, the thought about revealing himself to them had crossed his mind. But as quickly as it had appeared, it evaporated. He couldn't do it. Not yet, at least. "I do because I'm not a monster," he replied, though he had to fight against his own throat, which has tightened itself. He coughed a few times to regain full control over his voice. "Believe it or not, I do not want to see you dead," he added, once again trying to sound friendly. "If I did, like my second-in-command suggested, you wouldn't have survived the last night." He nearly whispered the last part, not believing that he had said those words. It had the desired effect, though. Gobber, Astrid, and Rough Nut trembled slightly, each one of them still had a fresh memory of Dager with wings instead of his back. Stoic just closed his eyes while Snotlout hissed at him. Hiccup turned around, surprised. His cousin was looking angrily at him, holding a small hammer in his palm. Hiccup eyed the tool carefully, wondering if Stoiczay would make use of it. He noticed that Snotlout's knuckles were becoming more and more white due to the strength with which he was gripping the small object. "Was that supposed to scare us?" he asked in a challenging tone. Hiccup heard that his father let out a resigned sigh, though he did nothing to stop Snotlout from speaking. The chief of Dreeki corrected his stance slightly, suddenly realizing the mistake he made. He was in the middle of the group of Burkians who considered him their mortal enemy. Steinar and 3 other guards were nearby, of course, but they wouldn't reach him in time if any of his prisoners decided to move against him. Toothless wouldn't make it in time as well. And Hiccup was defenseless. While it was true that none of the tools the Burkians had received were lethal, in their hands they could still be dangerous. "Perhaps," Hiccup replied, still looking at his cousin. He crossed his arms on his chest, eyeing the lower man carefully. If Snotlout attacked him, he would only have a split second to react. Snotlout hissed again. "You're only good at talking," he countered, trying to locate his eyes with his own, though they still remained hidden by the hood. "And your words are empty." "You might be correct," Hiccup agreed, nodding his head. "But my actions speak better for me. And from what I recall, you were the one who was scared the most during the night." He teased him, knowing precisely where to strike Snotlout his ego. The future chief of Berk shook angrily after hearing it, mostly because he knew that Hiccup was right. "Executing someone is one thing, but maybe you should try yourself against a real warrior," his cousin asked. Hiccup chuckled at that while Toothless growled menacingly from the distance. Steinar and the rest of the guards kept their hands on their weapons, ready to intervene at any second. "You can't be referring to yourself," he countered, smirking slightly. It was yet another comment directed at his cousin's ego. Snotlout's grip on the hammer tightened more, if that was even possible. "Enough!" Stoic yelled. Although it was directed at Snotlout, Hiccup couldn't help but take a step backward, taken by surprise by the sudden outburst. "Remember yourself," his father ordered again, looking at Snotlout. The younger man looked down in shame, though his grip on the hammer didn't lessen. Regaining his composure, Hiccup smirked once again. He had to admit that it was satisfying for him to finally stand up to Snotlout after years of being bullied and tormented by him, even if the lower man didn't know his true identity. With an incomprehensible mutter, Snotlout resumed his work, turning away from Hiccup. The chief of Dreeki smirked victoriously, though it went unnoticed by his cousin. The young man turned around, once again facing Gobber. "I believe I didn't hear a reply from you," Hiccup said, addressing his former mentor. "But perhaps you are too stubborn to admit it." "That's okay," he added quickly, noticing the anger that was making its way onto Gobber's face. "Perhaps I can find you a different job to do, but I have to know what you're good at," he finished, looking him straight in the eyes. Once again, he received silence as an answer. "He is our blacksmith," Stoic replied for Gobber. The chief of Berk has also noticed that working on the repairs was taking a heavy toll on his friend. "A blacksmith?" Hiccup asked, pretending to be surprised. "Well, that is fortunate. I could use an extra hand in the forge." "I'm not going anywhere near you," Gobber replied through gritted teeth, still refusing to look at him. He was focused on turning the tree trunk into a plank. "It's okay," Gobber Stoic told him, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "We will handle it. And I want to see you in one piece when this is all over," he added, patting him gently. The old blacksmith looked up, finding his chief's eyes with his own. It took him a split second to understand the message that was hidden in them: find Riddery's weakness, and exploit it if possible. He nodded his head wordlessly, accepting Stoic's order. "Fine," he agreed finally. Hiccup smiled genuinely at that, oblivious to their unspoken message. "Then let's go," he declared, straightening himself. "There is much that I have to do in the forge, and I've wasted enough of the day as it is." With that, the two left the group of Burkians, going up the hill where the forge was. Toothless was accompanying them all the time, walking behind his rider. It wasn't far away from Hiccup's house. It took them some time to reach it, mostly due to Gobber's difficulty at walking, but they've still managed to get there. Hiccup opened the door, inviting his former mentor inside. The old blacksmith eyed him cautiously before stepping in. The young chief ignited a few torches that were placed at the walls, illuminating the interior. Gobber looked around, taking in the strange, and at the same time, so familiar surroundings. This forge was much bigger than the one they've had on Berk, but it was arranged similarly. It had a stall which Hiccup opened almost immediately, allowing the fresh air to go inside. A large hearth was placed at one of the walls, filled with coals and small wooden logs. Next to the hearth was standing a barrel of water and an anvil. Gobber quickly noticed a pile of weapons that were lying nearby, swords, axes, hammers, and all kinds of steel arms. A thought of picking one up and plunging it into the young chief's chest had crossed his mind, though the Night Fury quickly made him forget that idea, growling slightly at him. Hiccup shushed his dragon immediately. "Sorry for the mess," he said, wiping away loose sheets of paper from one of the desks. "I didn't really have time to come in here for the past few days. You know that you're taking a great risk by allowing me to come here with you, don't you?" Gobber asked him, speaking to him for the first time since they've arrived. "This forge has a lot of weapons that I could use to end your life." "I know," Hiccup admitted, still occupied with clearing the area. "But, given your handicap, I doubt you would reach any weapon before I figure out what you intended to do. And even if you succeeded at that, and neither I nor Toothless would see it coming, you would still have to deal with the one angry Night Fury," he said, looking at his former mentor. "But, let's say you somehow manage to kill me and my dragon and make it out of the forge alive," he continued, leaning against the counter. "My second in command, Eret, is going to come here in no time, and he isn't as patient or as forgiving as I am. You, and your friends from Berk, would be executed immediately. But let's pretend it doesn't happen, and you walk out from here without any trouble. What would you do then?" he asked, not expecting to hear an answer. "You return to your chief and act as if nothing had happened. After some time, my men are going to notice my absence and they will start asking questions and looking around, searching for me. And when they find me and Toothless dead, they kill you because you have no means of escaping from our island. You would never reach the harbor in time, we don't have boats designed for long travels, and the seashores are already frozen. My men still catch you, execute you, and Eret takes over me and decides to visit Berk with all our might," he finished, still looking Gobber in the eyes. The old blacksmith seemed to be deep in his thoughts, judging whether the chief of Dreeki was right or wrong. He could see the reason behind his words, even if he refused to acknowledge it. The more he thought about it, the more sense it made. Hiccup could almost see the gears turning inside of Gobber's head. He closed his eyes, feeling shame for speaking to him like that. His former mentor has always been good to him when he used to live on Berk. But he had to warn him that if he did something stupid, it would bring dire consequences for him and the rest of his tribe. "As I've told Stoic, I don't see you as enemies," Hiccup continued. "And I hope that this will be mutual, for our sakes." Gobber nodded his head wordlessly at that, finally accepting that Hiccup's words were true. "Good," he summed up, heading towards the hearth. "Toothless, would you mind?" he asked his dragon. The Night Fury shook its head slightly and spat a small plasma blast at the coals that began to burn immediately. Hiccup quickly brought the blower to life and worked on making more and more of the coals and wooden logs burn steadily. Soon, the hearth was ready to use. "Let's get started," he announced, picking up one of the swords. "I need them melted down," Hiccup said, removing the blade from the hilt. He placed the metal in one of the large bowls that could withstand the high temperatures. "How did you get so many?" Gobber couldn't help but ask. He mimicked Hiccup's actions, and the two began working on the weapons. "Dagur had raided our village a few days ago," Hiccup replied nonchalantly. "That's what's left of his army. Wouldn't it be more efficient to repair them?" "No," he shook his head in disagreement. "Most of them have been constructed pretty badly, and the iron isn't durable. Even if I did my best to repair them, they would most probably break after just one hit. It takes more time to melt them down and remake them, but it pays off in the end." The two continued to work on separating the metal from the wood, placing the iron in the large bowl. When it was full, Hiccup placed the container over the hearth. Most of the coals were already burning, shining brightly. Hiccup looked out the window after noticing two figures coming towards the forge. His lips curled up in a smile. Just as he promised, Eret was coming to the forge with a small package in his left hand. But that wasn't the source of his happiness. It was because Zephyr was walking with him, holding the black-haired man's right arm. Hiccup could swear that his heart nearly pumped its way out of his chest. "Ah, great, Irette is coming here," he announced, wiping away the sweat from his forehead. He had removed his cloak almost immediately after he started working next to the hearth. His smile grew even wider when he heard a soft sound of footsteps outside of the forge. He couldn't wait to finally see his daughter. He picked up another sword, ready to dismantle it. "Hiccup!" Irette shouted before entering. His previous joy was quickly replaced with shock and fear. He paled visibly, looking at Gobber with the corner of his eye. Chapter 11. Despite his old age, Gobber had clearly heard the shout that came from Irette. At first, his mind didn't fully comprehend what that single word meant until both men heard another yell. "Hiccup, are you there?" the ex-dragon trapper asked loudly, approaching the forge steadily. That's when something clicked inside of the old blacksmith's head. He slowly turned around to face the other person in the room. He was surprised when the first thing he saw was the tip of the sword that the younger man was holding in his hand. Gobber was following the length of the blade with his eyes, making his way towards the person who was standing in front of him. Unlike earlier during the morning, the man had a slightly frightened expression on his face. Gobber noticed that he trembled a little while doing his best to hold the sword as steady as possible. It was difficult to find the similarities due to the years that have passed since he had last seen Hiccup, but he couldn't deny they were there. His hair wasn't a mess anymore, it was arranged into a small braid at the back of his head. All the freckles have disappeared from his face, and half of it was covered by an auburn beard the same color as his hair. But what didn't change, and never could have changed, were his eyes, ones he had most definitely inherited from Stoic and Valka. They were still shining with a bright green just as his father's used to when he was younger. Gobber forced his mind to create a picture of the man in front of him without the facial hair. Although it was difficult, he had succeeded after a few seconds, summing up what his imagination had shown him with a single gasp. The man in front of him Riddery was Hiccup, Stoic's long-lost son and his former apprentice, even if the entire Burg believed him to be dead. "Hiccup?" he asked hesitantly, taking a careful step forward. The younger man only corrected his grip on the sword, lifting it higher into the air, almost pressing it against Gobber's throat. He gulped loudly. "Come in, Irette," he yelled back, not taking his eyes off Gobber for a split second. Both men heard a small scratch of the wooden door, but only the old blacksmith turned his head to look at the person who walked into the forge. "I've seen the smoke coming out from the forge, so I figured you were already here, and..." Irette began to say but stopped immediately after noticing a stranger in the room. "Oh," he commented, failing to find a better word. "Yes," Hiccup agreed. "Oh. Talk about bad timing, Irette." "I believe he had heard you yelling my name," he replied, still holding the sword high in the air. That's when he remembered that his second-in-command wasn't the only person who walked into the forge. Hiccup's eyes were immediately drawn to his daughter. She was gripping Irette's hand tightly, looking cautiously around the forge, until her eyes met Hiccup. The young man felt his heart shattering into thousands of pieces as he quickly noticed the same fear in Zephyr's gaze he had seen during the night. He lowered his sword and handed it to Irette. "Keep an eye on my guest," he told him, still looking at his child. His second-in-command nodded wordlessly at that and assumed Hiccup's previous stance, making sure that Gobber wouldn't move a single muscle. As a result, he had to let go of Zephyr's hand, leaving her alone in the middle of the forge. "Zephyr." Hiccup spoke softly, approaching her carefully. He raised both of his hands, attempting to make her understand that he meant no harm. "Sweetheart," he addressed her again when the little girl didn't move a single muscle. She was gripping the small stuffed Night Fury, pressing the toy tightly against her chest. "It's me, your daddy," Hiccup added, smiling reassuringly, though it proved to be more difficult than he anticipated. Zephyr's eyes were still filled with fear. He reached out both of his hands, attempting to lure her into a hug. His daughter still didn't move at all. Hiccup kneeled on the wooden floor, keeping a safe distance between him and the little girl. He didn't want to scare her even more. Hiccup was approaching her hesitantly, moving one knee at a time. At least Zephyr wasn't backing away. He smiled weakly at that. He thought that it took him forever to crawl to her, but he had finally managed to reach his daughter, who was still standing at the same spot, seemingly glued to the floor. Hiccup brought her to himself, almost crushing her against his chest in a tight embrace. "Zephyr, look at me," he whispered after leaning backward a bit. The small girl lifted her eyes hesitantly. "Remember what I've told you yesterday? That everything I did during the night, I did it to protect you and because I love you," he reminded her, looking straight into her green eyes. She nodded her head slowly at that. "I was scared," she whispered to him, still holding her toy with both of her hands. Hiccup pressed her against his chest once again. It wasn't long before he felt her trembling slightly, and quiet sobs could have been heard from the little girl. He closed his eyes and sighed heavily. "I know," he replied, stroking her auburn hair that for once wasn't put into a braid. He nearly forgot how long they actually were, reaching all the way down to the end of her back. "And I'm sorry that you had to witness it, but you have to know one thing," he said to her, once again leaning back to look at her. Tears were running down Zephyr's cheeks, causing Hiccup's heart to once again shatter into thousands of pieces. "That man I've dealt with during the night had caused almost everyone in our village to suffer terribly. And he was the one responsible for your nightmares," he revealed to her, looking her straight into the eyes. He brushed away a single strand of hair that fell on her face. "You were a small kid when that happened," Hiccup whispered, holding her cheek. "I couldn't believe that you remembered what happened back then. That man has almost killed you, sweetheart," he whispered the last part, afraid of saying it louder. "I had to make sure that no one I care about would suffer because of him again. That includes you as well." "Mostly you," Hiccup corrected himself, smiling weakly at his daughter. "He was the man from my dreams?" Zephyr asked, sniffling quietly. "Yes. And that's why I needed to make sure that he wouldn't be able to harm you again," Hiccup said, caressing her cheek softly. He wiped away a single tear with his thumb. "And since you are a part of this tribe, you had every right to witness the end of that man," he added quietly. The little girl looked down at her stuffed toy. "Zephyr," Hiccup whispered, once again lifting her head gently with his hand. "I love you, sweetheart," he said, putting as many emotions into those words as he possibly could. "I love you too, Daddy," the little girl murmured, and this time it was she who pressed herself tightly against Hiccup's chest, doing her best to encircle his torso with her tiny arms. The young man smiled at the gesture and eagerly returned the embrace, placing a soft kiss on Zephyr's forehead. "I promise you will never see me like that again," he whispered to her and felt her nodding her head. "Now, I know you were afraid, but it's time for you to move those feelings aside, okay? I know it's not easy, but you are a Viking after all," he reminded her. "And we don't fear anything," he added with a small smile. His words seemed to work on his daughter because the little girl tried to return the smile through the remnants of her tears. "Besides, do you still want to learn how to fly on a dragon?" he asked. Zephyr nodded her head vigorously. "Yes," she replied quickly. "Good," Hiccup commented with a smile. "But you have to know that dragons don't let on their backs people who are afraid." "Have I told you about the first time I flew with Toothless?" he asked her, causing her to shake her head in contradiction. "Well, that wasn't my most pleasurable flight if I do say so myself," Hiccup said with a small chuckle. "I was hanging on his tail, doing my best to remain on him, but Toothless wasn't too fond of me, you know. So when he was flying, he threw me off of himself, straight into a lake," he said. Zephyr was staring at him with wide eyes, glancing at the Night Fury from time to time. "And do you know why he did that?" Hiccup asked, once again bringing the girl's attention back to himself. "It was because I was terrified," he whispered to her. "And he must have sensed it. You have to know that dragons don't want scared people to ride on them, isn't that right?" "But," he asked, directing the question to Toothless. The Night Fury growled a few times as if it tried to confirm its rider's words. Hiccup chuckled at that. "So you see, if you want to ride a dragon, you cannot show fear, or you'll end up on the ground in no time." "You really were afraid?" Zephyr asked, not believing what she had just heard. Hiccup chuckled again. "Yes, I was," he confirmed. "But then it changed. And when I stopped being afraid of him, I've become the greatest dragon rider in the entire archipelago," he added, earning himself a small chuckle from Irette and a series of growls from Toothless. He ignored both of them. "So you see, you have to overcome all of your fears, and one day you will become the dragon rider yourself, and possibly the best Viking warrior to ever exist," he added with a small smile. Zephyr's lips curled up into a smile as well. Even better than you, she asked with an excited gleam in her eyes. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves, Hiccup replied with a faked seriousness, though he failed to keep up a straight face for a longer period and chuckled slightly. He ruffled Zephyr's hair in an affectionate gesture and stood up from his knees. We can start practicing flying tomorrow if you want, he offered. But for now, I must ask you to go outside with Toothless and practice staying on his back. Mastering it would help you a lot once you find yourselves in the skies. Are you coming with me? Zephyr asked hopefully, attempting to drag him outside. Not now, sweetheart, Hiccup refused apologetically, carefully removing his hand from his daughter's grip. I have a lot of work to do here, and I have to talk to my guest, he explained, gesturing at Gobber, who was still standing in his original place. Irette will accompany you, though he added quickly, noticing she was saddened by his words. Besides, I'll keep an eye out on you through the store. And I promise I'll join you once I'm finished here. Although reluctantly, Zephyr left the forge, accompanied by Toothless, who let out a small growl of uneasiness because he had to leave his rider without any protection from the old blacksmith. Hiccup urged Irette to go out as well, reassuring him that he would be all right. His second-in-command handed him the small package that contained the materials for the wedding rings and left the forge as well. When the door behind the trio was closed, Hiccup's smile instantly vanished from his face as he turned around to face Gobber once again. The old blacksmith seemed to be frozen in place, looking at Hiccup with an expression that was a mixture of shock, relief, anger, and joy. It could have easily been said that Gobber looked as if he had seen a ghost. Hiccup guessed that it was exactly the case. An uncomfortable silence filled the forge. Well? Hiccup asked, finally deciding to speak. You're just going to stare at me? It's really you, Gobber murmured, visibly holding back the tears. The younger man nodded his head in confirmation. Before he could register what was happening, the old blacksmith rushed at him with the speed Hiccup didn't know he possessed. In a blink of an eye, the chief of Dreeki found himself in Gobber's tight grip that threatened to break his bones. Hiccup was gasping for air, trying to free himself from the strong embrace. He was struggling against his former mentor, though his efforts turned out to be in vain. He tried to tell Gobber that he risked crashing or suffocating him, but his voice failed him as well. A few seconds later, just as Hiccup was about to fall unconscious due to the lack of oxygen, the old blacksmith pulled away, allowing his former student to finally breathe properly. Hiccup coughed a few times and breathed in the air greedily, afraid that it would be denied to him in no time. It is you. Gobber repeated, this time louder. He took Hiccup's face in his hand and stump, examining him closely. He wasn't even trying to hold back the tears that were running down his cheeks, finding shelter in his long mustache. Hiccup felt his own eyes watering, though he wasn't sure if that was caused by the emotions or by the bone-crushing embrace. Thorsbeard, you've grown, he exclaimed. Yeah, it's me, Hiccup confirmed when he regained control over his voice. But how? Gobber asked excitedly, still not believing his eyes. You were dead. Excuse me. You were dead, he repeated. The dragons took you away. That's not how I remember it, Hiccup countered, stretching his back that became sore because of the embrace. It doesn't matter now, we must tell Stoic. Gobber exclaimed and began hobbling towards the exit of the forge. No. Hiccup replied immediately, reaching the door before his former mentor did. He blocked the only way out with his body, pressing his back tightly against the wood. No, he repeated, shaking his head. Are you mad, Hiccup? Gobber asked him with a puzzled expression. Do you have any idea what your father has been going through for the past 10 years? He must know that you're alive. No, he doesn't, Hiccup countered instantly, once again shaking his head. If he believes that I have been killed by the dragons, then I don't want to disappoint him once again, he explained. It will be better for me and him if he believes I'm dead. Did you hit your head against something? Gobber queried. He is your father. He has every right to know, and it's your obligation to tell him that you're alive. No, he doesn't. Hiccup repeated louder, still blocking the door. Don't you dare raise your voice to me, boy, Gobber replied angrily, attempting to push Hiccup out of his path. I'm not a boy, Gobber, Hiccup replied, trying to calm himself. I am the chief here, he added, looking his former mentor straight into the eyes. It was easier than it used to be when he was younger because he was taller than the old blacksmith. And my word is the law here. Whether I'm Riddery or Hiccup, it doesn't change the fact that you are my prisoner, which gives you absolutely no control over me. Only after his words, Gobber realized, although reluctantly, that he wasn't standing in front of his former apprentice anymore. The boy he used to know had grown up into a man and a chief nonetheless. And he wasn't there to see it. Hiccup, Stoic is your father, he reminded him once again, this time not yelling at him. I've seen him after he lost Valka when you were a small boy. It killed something inside him, but he was able to go on because he still had you, he said gently. Hiccup closed his eyes, listening carefully to his former mentor. He felt fresh tears gathering beneath his eyelids. And when he lost you, I've never seen anyone as broken as he was, Gobber added. For the past 10 years, there wasn't a day when I wouldn't see him mourning after you and your mother. He believed you have been killed by a dragon, Hiccup. Then at least he believed I died like a true Viking, the young man countered, opening his eyes. He was glad that he was leaning against the wooden door because he wasn't sure if he would be able to stand on his own. Perhaps it's the only thing I did that didn't cause him to be disappointed with me. What are you talking about? Gobber asked with a dumbfounded expression. You are his son. He has never been disappointed with you. Angry, perhaps, but not disappointed. Really? Hiccup replied with a question of his own. Because each time there was a dragon raid, I've caused more damage than any of them while trying to help. Ever since I could remember, I've wanted to prove to my father that I could be the same great warrior he was. But each time, I've only seen the disappointment in his eyes. Never have I heard from him that it didn't matter that I've failed because at least I've tried, he continued, not trying to stop the tears from falling from his eyes. Every time after each raid, I've seen in the way he was looking at me that he wished someone else was his son. Do you remember the last raid before you took us to the dragon training? The one when you claimed you shot down the Night Fury? Yes, Hiccup confirmed, nodding his head. And I didn't only claim it, I did this. It's the same Night Fury who had been here a few minutes ago. After that raid, when, once again, I've caused even more of Burke's livestock to get carried away, Stoic said that I was no dragon killer, he said, sniffling quietly. I went to the forest immediately, knowing that the Night Fury I've shot down was somewhere there, at the Raven Point. It took me hours, but I have somehow found him. I've wanted to cut off its heart and bring it to my father to prove that I was a real Viking, like him. But I couldn't, he finished, his voice faltered at the last sentence. Hiccup cleared his throat. I couldn't have forced myself to kill a defenseless creature who suffered because of me. Why not? Gobber asked him, once again looking at him with a dumbfounded expression. Dragons are never defenseless, he reminded him. Hiccup took in a shaky breath. I couldn't because when Toothless opened his eyes, he was as terrified as I was, he murmured, recalling the first encounter with his best friend. I've looked into his eyes, and I saw myself. So I've cut down the ropes that were holding him. He pounced at me, pinning me to the ground, and I was sure that it was going to be the end of me. And what happened? He just roared at me, Hiccup replied with a small chuckle, although he found nothing funny in that situation 10 years ago. Even to this day, he remembered how hard it was for him to keep control of his bladder. And then he disappeared in the forest, allowing me to live. That's ridiculous, Gobber countered, shaking his head. Dragons never leave anyone alive, especially the Night Furies. Then how would you explain the fact that I'm riding one? Hiccup asked. For the next few weeks, after the dragon training in the arena, I would go into the forest, to Toothless. It took us some time, but we've eventually learned how to cooperate and, at some point, we've become friends. That would explain how you've suddenly become so good at dragon training, Gobber commented, stroking his long mustache. Hiccup nodded his head in agreement. Yes, he confirmed. And then, when I had been chosen to kill the monstrous nightmare, I knew I wouldn't be able to do it. Stoic didn't know how true his words about me were. I wasn't a dragon killer. I couldn't, and I still can't kill a dragon even if my life depended on it, Hiccup finished with a heavy sigh. He pushed himself off of the door and approached the stall clumsily. He leaned against the counter. From this point, he could see his entire village, but his eyes were focused only on Zephyr and his dragon. "I couldn't risk Toothless' life," he said gently, watching as his daughter was riding on the Night Fury's back, a little more confidently than she used to the day before. "Back then, he was my only friend, except for you, maybe," he added after a moment of consideration. "There was no other way out of that mess, so I just left," he finished. "And you've abandoned your family and your village for a dragon," Gobber summed up, leaning against the counter himself. Hiccup chuckled again, although this time, it was deprived of humor. "I didn't have a family, Gobber," he replied. "I don't deny that you were the closest person to a friend I've had, but a friend is not the same as family. And Stoic just was," he added before the old blacksmith could reply. "And my village." He trailed off, snorting slightly. "It wasn't my village. Not because I didn't care about Burke, but because Burke didn't care about me," he explained. "If you think that I wasn't aware that many people were disappointed with me even more than Stoic was, then you're wrong. I know that no one wanted me as the future chief and that the council has appointed Snotlout as the next heir, long before I've vanished," he said, finally looking at Gobber. The old blacksmith didn't say anything in return because he knew that Hiccup's words were true. "This is my family now," Gobber Hiccup continued, gesturing at Zephyr and Toothless. "And this is my village," he added, pointing at the people who were walking around, minding their own business. "How did this happen?" Gobber couldn't help but ask. He gestured at the Dreeki tribe. "As always, when I've tried to do something it was an accident," Hiccup replied with a small chuckle. "When I've returned to the archipelago 5 years ago, Dager was conquering other tribes. I had my makeshift home here, and I was trying to help those who had survived the Berserkers' attacks. With time, this place was getting more and more crowded and, eventually, they've appointed me as their chief. I guess that riding on the unholy offspring of lightning and death itself had something to do with it," he added with a small smirk. "You've returned?" Gobber queried. "From where?" "Everywhere," Hiccup replied without even thinking about the answer. "And nowhere. When I've left Burke, I traveled south. I've crossed the sea and reached the mainland. I've spent there a few years, traveling all the time, never staying anywhere for too long. But, eventually, I think I started to miss the archipelago. So I've returned." "Everywhere and nowhere," Gobber commented, trying to imitate his voice. "You're not good at answering questions, Hiccup." "I might tell you more some other day," he replied, still smirking slightly. "But it takes a lot of time to describe everything." "However," Hiccup said after a moment of silence. He pushed himself off from the counter and looked at his former mentor. "If you promise not to tell Stoic who I really am, I can share with you what was happening to me for the past decade." "You can't ask me that," Gobber countered with a heavy sigh. "I want to see my best friend smiling again. And I don't want to see the disappointment in his eyes anymore," Hiccup countered. He sighed heavily, wiping his face. "I've always wanted to be the son he deserved. I've wanted to be the best dragon killer of all time, but each time I've tried, I've only been disappointing Stoic even more. If he thinks that I've died fighting a dragon, then perhaps he has some respect towards me. And I'm not going to shatter it by revealing that his only son has befriended his greatest enemy." "It's cruel not to tell him," Hiccup Gobber replied, placing a hand on the younger man's shoulder. For a split second, both men felt as if they were back in Burke's Forge when they've used to be a master and an apprentice. "Not to mention selfish," he reprimanded the chief of Dreeki. "I might tell him one day," Hiccup replied, nodding his head. He saw the reason behind Gobber's words. "But I'll do it only when I'm absolutely sure that it will be best for both of us. I knew that meeting him would be inevitable when I've decided to return to the archipelago, but I still wasn't ready for it. Especially not under such circumstances," Hiccup clarified and picked up the leather package he received from Irette. He untied the knot and scattered the bag's content onto the table. Inside were a few gold coins, a handful of dragon scales, and 2 small gemstones. Hiccup recognized them as emeralds after a closer inspection. "That lass who came here," Gobber began awkwardly, agreeing to drop the previous topic. "She's your daughter." "I'm surprised it took you so long to figure that out," Hiccup commented sarcastically while pulling out the scroll he received from Irette the previous day. "Yes, she is my daughter," he confirmed. "She looks so much like you," Gobber said, looking over Hiccup's shoulder to see what he was focused on. Though I have to say that she's prettier than you when you were a kid, he added with a small chuckle. Thanks, Hiccup replied with a small snort. He had to admit that he missed bantering with his former mentor. And, her mother is? Gobber trailed off, attempting to get some information from the younger man. She is dead, Hiccup said simply, pulling out another bowl used for melting down objects, but this one was much smaller than the previous one. I'm sorry, Gobber stuttered when he regained control over his voice. He was stunned by how easy it was for Hiccup to say those words. I didn't mean to. Don't worry, the younger man interrupted him in mid-sentence. You couldn't have known. How did she die? Gobber couldn't help but ask. It didn't take a genius to realize that it was a sensitive topic for his former apprentice, but his own curiosity took over his rational mind. Hiccup sighed heavily. She was killed by Dager and his berserkers when Zephyr was very young, he informed him, throwing the coins into the bowl. He placed it over the hearth, waiting for the gold to melt down entirely. It was the man you've executed tonight. Gobber clarified. Hiccup confirmed with a nod of his head. Everyone in my village suffered because of him, he explained. He had to be dealt with once and for all. I've never seen the Blood Eagle before, Gobber revealed to him. Neither have I, Hiccup commented with a heavy sigh. And I hope I'll never be forced to witness it again. I believe none of you had ever seen it being performed. No, Gobber confirmed. Even your father had never seen it. You looked terrifyingly tonight. Do you know that? With all that paint and then the blood on your clothes. And all I have accomplished by that was scaring my little girl, Hiccup commented dryly. Never before have I seen her so frightened. You can't blame her, Gobber comforted him, placing another blade into the bigger bowl. You've managed to scare all of us. Snotlout seemed to disagree with it, Hiccup commented with a small chuckle. Gobber rolled his eyes. Oh please, he had nearly shit himself tonight, he replied, earning a genuine laugh from Hiccup. And to think that he threatened to perform the Blood Eagle himself, he trailed off. For what? Hiccup asked, slightly puzzled. Being an heir has elevated his ego high above the clouds, Gobber replied, sighing heavily. He decreed that if anyone proposes to Astrid, he will be executed immediately. What? Hiccup asked, not believing his ears. You've heard me. He had his eyes on her ever since I could remember. And given that he will be our next chief, he had the first pick when it comes to choosing his future wife. And what did Astrid do about it? She couldn't really do anything. Her parents have reached an agreement with the Jorgensens, and they've accepted the bride price already. So she's betrothed to him. Hiccup guessed, hiding a small trace of sadness that has appeared in his voice. Luckily for him, Gobber didn't notice it. Yes, he confirmed. They've agreed that the marriage will occur when the situation on Berk become a little more stable. How bad is it, Gobber? Hiccup asked with a heavy sigh. His former mentor mimicked him and sighed as well. I don't remember it being any worse, to be honest. The dragon raids are more and more frequent while our livestock is growing smaller each week. I'm afraid that Berk won't survive this winter, he murmured. Hiccup didn't fail to notice the sadness in his voice. He felt the small pang of guilt in his heart. They've requested his help, and he refused to give them one. But he had his motives. It can't be that bad, he commented. Berk had survived over 300 years of raids, it surely can make it through this winter as well. Even if it does, it will be at a heavy price, Gobber countered, looking him in the eyes. That's why we're here, Hiccup. We actually need your help, he reminded him, causing the younger man to sigh heavily again. I can't go to Helheim's Gate, Gobber, Hiccup replied immediately with an apologetical look. I've been there a few times already, and I know what resides there, he added. I can't risk the life of my own people by going to war with that thing, he trailed off, failing to find the better word. They've entrusted their safety to my safekeeping. And I can't break their trust. So you know how to reach that island? Gobber asked him. Hiccup confirmed wordlessly with a small nod of his head. Then, at the very least, tell us how to do that, he pleaded him. Because each of our expeditions has ended with the same result: we've failed to reach the Helheim's Gate. If you as much as tell us how to get there, we can handle anything that resides in there. I won't do it, Hiccup replied immediately. For your own safety, I'm not going to tell you how to reach that island. And what could possibly be so scary in there? A dragon, Hiccup answered bluntly. Gobber snorted at that. We've killed dragons before, Gobber countered immediately. We can handle that. No, you can't, Hiccup replied, shaking his head in disagreement. You've never seen such a thing before. I witnessed it devour an adult Gronkle in one piece, without even chewing, he told him. Gobber looked at him as if he had grown out a second head. You're kidding, right? Nothing can be that big. Ask Astrid if you don't believe me. Astrid? And what would she know about it? Gobber asked, puzzled once again. Because she had been there with me when Toothless took me to Helheim's Gate for the first time, Hiccup informed him, causing Gobber to look at him with wide eyes once again. I didn't plan it, though, he added quickly. I've never intended to go there in the first place, but it just happened. So that's it, the old blacksmith asked after a moment of silence. You're just going to let us die slowly? If you manage to convince Stoic to form an alliance with me, then I can offer to trade with you, Hiccup suggested. We have enough livestock for the entire winter, and our island is extremely fertile. Also, we don't have any raids in here. That's all I can do. I won't go to Helheim's Gate, I can assure you of that. It won't matter anyway if we will be staying here for the rest of the winter, though, Gobber replied with a heavy sigh. He sat down on a small chair next to the hearth. If Stoic agrees to be allies, we will be able to carry you back to Berk, Hiccup offered. But you have to convince him first. I won't ask any of my men to risk theirs and their dragons' lives just for this single trip. Gobber nodded his head a few times, considering Hiccup's offer. He still didn't believe what he said about the Helheim's Gate, though. And he couldn't wait to ask Astrid to see if she would confirm it. I can try to do that, he said after a moment of silence. But it will be difficult. You know how stubborn your father can be. You've inherited that from him after all, he added, causing Hiccup to nod his head in agreement. But enough about Berk, we can talk about it later. What has been happening to you for all these years, Hiccup? He asked. The young man didn't fail to notice how quickly Gobber's mood had changed. From saddened and depressed to joyful and curious in a matter of a split second. Thorsbeard, I still can't believe you're alive, boy. And how much you have changed. Do you want me to tell you from the beginning? Hiccup asked with a small smirk. That would be the best, Gobber agreed. Well, everything has its price, Hiccup countered, still smirking. Take these tongs and help me here, he ordered with a chuckle. Gobber shook his head with a resigned sigh. How did it happen that you're the one bossing me around in the forge? He queried, earning a small laugh from Hiccup. Chapter 12. As I've said, I went south, Hiccup said, creating a casting mold for the rings. He prepared a small wooden box and filled it with dirt, mashing it up tightly to form a firm mass. Then, while looking at the scroll with measurements, he began cutting out the holes, in which he would pour the melted gold. It was a tedious task that required a steady hand and a precise eye. It took him a dozen or so minutes to finish the casting mold. I wanted to go as far away from the archipelago as I could. And I believe I have found the edge of the world there, he said, picking up the tongs. How can you be so sure? Gobber asked, still working on the weapons that Hiccup wanted to melt. Because I've reached the land that, no matter where you see, is covered with sand, Hiccup explained, picking up the small bowl with the tongs. Like a giant beach, Gobber commented, dismantling an axe. The younger man chuckled at that. A little, he agreed while pouring the molten gold into the mold. He squinted his eyes, feeling the heat from the metal. But it's not so nice. There is nothing there to cast shadows, and you have to suffer under the sun for the entire day. Imagine the hottest summer on Berk, it pales by comparison to the temperatures out there. There are also little to no water sources out there, but what surprised me greatly, were the nights. And why is that? Because, contrary to the daytime, the nights are terribly cold, Hiccup explained. After nearly dying due to the heat during the time, I was trembling after the sunset. Also, the water I had with me had almost frozen back then, he said with a small smile. Neither I nor Toothless would have made it out alive if it wasn't for the people who have found us. People can live in such conditions? Gobber asked, clearly puzzled. Hiccup nodded his head. Apparently. You can imagine my surprise when I woke up the next day in some stranger's tent. I was being attended to by some woman with Toothless lying near me. I was shocked to see that they didn't kill him, to be honest. I thought that everyone would kill a dragon at first sight. And why didn't they? I guess that because they have never seen one, Hiccup answered, putting down the small bowl and the tongs, allowing the gold to cool down. Dragons aren't as common in the south as they are here. Of course, they have their legends about them, but until they've met I and Toothless, they've never seen one. They weren't hostile, luckily, just curious. But communication was terrible, he finished with a chuckle, failing to find a better word. Why is that? Gobber asked, trying to imagine the things Hiccup was describing to him. Believe it or not, Gobber, but not everyone in the world speaks our language, he replied, helping the old blacksmith with the weapons. The pile was getting smaller and smaller with every minute. Hiccup picked up the bowl with the molten iron and poured it into another casting mold, in which the liquid would turn into ingots. The people I've met in that land call themselves Muslim. This word is used by them to define their allegiance to their religion. That's another strange thing about those people, they believe only in one god, Hiccup informed his former mentor, earning a surprised look from him. They only worship Odin, he queried, clearly surprised. Hiccup chuckled again and shook his head. No. Their god is called Allah, if I remember correctly. They didn't hear about Yggdrasil, and they believe only in 3 worlds, the one here, Jana our Valhalla, and Jahannam our Helheim. And what do these people look like? Gobber couldn't help but ask. He had to admit that he was mesmerized by Hiccup's tales. They are similar to us, the younger man replied after a moment of hesitation. I mean, they are also humans, but they are different. Their skin is mostly brown and, sometimes, even black. Despite the incredible heat of that place, they are covered from toes to heads, and they are riding on some strange creatures. They are as tall as an adult man, they move on 4 legs, and they have these 2 strange humps on their back between which the rider sits. Also, they are all covered with fur that has a light brown color. They also produce incredible milk, much tastier than the yaks. It's difficult to imagine such an animal, Gobber commented, failing to create a picture of the creature that Hiccup described to him. The younger man chuckled at that again, wordlessly agreeing with his old mentor. Yeah. Anyway, I've spent with them around 1.5 years, he continued. With time, I was able to learn the basics of their language, but I've never learned how to read their texts. They have a very different method of writing than we do. It's mostly curved lines, read from right to left. But the longer I've spent there, the easier it was for me to talk to some of them. At first, I was just trying to show with my hands what I've wanted to say. They've allowed me to live with them for a price, of course. They took me from the middle of nowhere to one of the biggest cities I have ever seen, called Alexandria in Egypt. Believe me, when I say it, that city was huge. I've tried to walk around it once, it took me a full day to encircle it. I've worked there as a blacksmith, utilizing what I've learned from you in exchange for food, a place to live, and lessons. Well, good to know that you weren't ignoring me completely back on Berk, Gobber commented with a small chuckle. It was mimicked by Hiccup. And what lessons did you take there? Dueling, mostly, Hiccup replied. I've wanted to know how to fight, and some of them agreed to train me. They have different weapons there than we do. It's a sword, theoretically, but it's not straight, it's curved. It's much lighter than what we use, and you don't make thrusts with it, only cuts. If I remember correctly, it's called saber. Hold on a second, I believe I have one somewhere in here, he added quickly before Gobber could ask another question. He was searching through various equipment that was scattered around in the forge. After a few minutes, Hiccup exclaimed victoriously, revealing the weapon he had just described. Truthfully to his words, the saber was curved, not perfectly straight. Gobber looked at it with wide eyes, wondering how someone could use it as a weapon. His eyes grew even wider, if that was possible, when he saw that Hiccup was handing the object to him. He accepted it hesitantly, afraid of breaking it. He gasped in surprise when he felt that the saber's weight was smaller than he expected. As I've said, it's much lighter than a regular sword, Hiccup commented, seeing the unasked question in his former mentor's eyes. But it's also my improved version of this weapon. The ones I've learned to use in Alexandria were much heavier. Improved? Gobber asked, examining the odd weapon closely. He had to admit that the craftsmanship of the blade was top-notch. It took him a while to realize that it was made by Hiccup, his former apprentice. He couldn't deny the pride he felt. Yes. At some point during my travels, I've discovered that the Gronkles, when fed enough, can produce an extremely durable and light iron. I've experimented with it a little, and, eventually, I have created my entire arsenal of that material. I don't have it with me now, though, but it's very efficient because I'm not overwhelmed by the weight of the few swords that I'm usually carrying around with me. Something that light can't be strong enough to be a weapon, Gobber countered, still not believing that the blade that he was holding could have been used in battle. Hold it for me, could you? Hiccup asked, handing him one of the regular swords. Gobber accepted it, returning the saber to him. Hold it in front of you, he ordered. The old blacksmith did as he was asked. Before Gobber could realize what was happening, Hiccup hauled off and brought the saber in a horizontal cut. The old blacksmith expected to feel the strength of the blow on the sword, but, to his surprise, he felt nothing. He opened his eyes slowly, wondering if Hiccup even managed to hit the sword. After all, he heard the familiar sound of the blade cutting the air. He was surprised to see that the sword he was holding was cut in half, destroyed by a single cut made by Hiccup. His eyes widened at that because it was the first time in his life that he saw someone destroying a weapon with such ease. Gobber eyed the broken blade carefully until his eyes were drawn back to the saber that Hiccup was holding. He didn't fail to notice a victorious smirk on his former student's face. Take a note that it's only a prototype, Hiccup commented, putting down the sword. The weapons I'm using are even better than this one. How is it possible? Gobber couldn't help but ask, still mesmerized. Can you teach me how to make such weapons? He asked hopefully. He was already imagining how efficient those would be against dragons. I could, Hiccup said after a moment of thinking. But I won't, he added almost immediately. Why not? Call it a professional secrecy, Hiccup replied, returning to the rings. The gold has almost entirely cooled down. Also, if you were to make weapons like that, you would have to learn how to live with dragons. And knowing you, Stoic, and pretty much Berk itself, I doubt that would ever happen, he explained. Oh. Anyway, back to the story, Hiccup said, dropping the topic. I lived in Alexandria for some time, working in the forge. People in the city were a little skeptical about the whole dragon stuff, and some were looking at me unfavorably, but I've quickly found myself an ally in there. It was a high-ranking Feeric in their army. I've gained his favor by being the only blacksmith in the city who had been able to complete his order. He requested the best saber available and, after some time, I've managed to create it. With Toothless' help, of course. The dragon fire is much better at melting down objects than a regular fire. Yeah, I know something about it, Gobber muttered under his breath. And what did he request? In the south, they have this technique of creating a very durable and sharp metal. It's called the Damascene steel. Basically, it's about combining various metals in high temperatures. Although the entire process sounds easy, it's not that simple. I had to be extremely careful not to break the cheaper metals, but, after a few failed attempts, I was able to finish the saber. That Feeric, Abdulkori was his name, offered to train me in combat as a form of gratitude. I've eagerly accepted the offer, of course. Over time, we even became friends. Under his eyes, I would increase my skills in fighting, and learn their language while producing various items for him in the forge. He used to invite me to his house very often, usually for dinner. He even offered me to convert to their religion, and he would make sure I'd find a high place in their army. It was tempting to accept it in the beginning, to be honest. You know, after Berk, it was strange to have people wanting me to be around. I've almost accepted the offer. What made you change your mind? Gobber asked, feeling a small pang of guilt after hearing Hiccup's words, especially combined with what he had said earlier. He couldn't deny that he was right. As always, I've screwed up, Hiccup replied with a humorless chuckle. It almost brought a smile to Gobber's lips. Almost. Abdulkori had a wife who seemed to find me interesting. At first, she was only watching me from afar, sometimes visiting me in the forge. We rarely spoke, to be honest. I didn't know much about her, other than her name Nadia. She was very beautiful, he commented, recalling his time in Alexandria. She had olive skin and the prettiest brown eyes I have ever seen, they were almost as black as the night sky itself. So, at first, she would only watch me, sometimes from afar, sometimes from a closer distance. Eventually, she invited me to her bed, he whispered with a slight blush. Gobber chuckled at that. Well, I never took you for such a womanizer, hiccup, he commented. The younger man chuckled as well. Never considered one myself, he replied, still chuckling. He shook his head and sighed slightly. I've enjoyed it, I'm not going to lie to you. At first, I thought that was what I've wanted, but I was wrong. There was nothing romantic between us, only lust. She wasn't even that interested in me. After all, back then, I looked like I used to on Burke. But she was fascinated by the fact that I was a foreigner. Never before had she seen one. She didn't see me as me, but as an Earthman. Who? Gobber asked after hearing yet another foreign word. Northman, hiccup translated. One day, Abdul walked in on us, and I had to run for my life, he said with a chuckle. I've quickly packed a few of my things and a few gifts I've received from him before he could execute me. It was easier to do it on Toothless Spack. Even though I've enjoyed it in the beginning, I regret it now. I've considered Abdul to be my friend, and I have betrayed him. He had shown me nothing but acceptance, and I've practically stabbed him in the back, he finished with a small frown. So, in that Alexandria, there is a small version of you running around? Gobber asked teasingly. Hiccup rolled his eyes at the question. No, he replied. All the women I've been with during my travels have always made sure to avoid getting pregnant. They have something they call the moon tea that is supposed to make the women temporarily infertile. All the women? Gobber queried, looking at him with a surprised look on his face. How many exactly? A few, Hiccup replied after a moment of wondering. He leaned against the counter and watched his daughter on Toothless Spack. The black dragon was running around the grassy plain with the little girl holding its back. Even from that distance, Hiccup could hear her laughter. It brought a smile to his face. He was surprised to see that the sun was already setting, illuminating everything with orange light. But just as with Nadia, I had no romantic relationship with any of them. It was always a fascination with how strange we were to one another. But that wasn't the case with her mother. Gobber asked, also leaning against the counter. He followed Hiccup's gaze and watched his daughter on the Night Fury's back. He was still amazed that the young man would allow his child to play with the unholy offspring of lightning and death itself. Hiccup only shook his head, not finding the strength to reply. Was she pretty? Gobber couldn't help but ask. Well, you've said it yourself that she's more beautiful than I used to be as a child, so yes, Hiccup replied sarcastically. Does she know that her mother is? Gobber trailed off, afraid of finishing the question. He heard the young man sigh heavily. No, Hiccup muttered. His former mentor barely heard him. Each time Zephyr asks me about her, I have to lie to her. Each time I'm telling her that her mother would return one day, that she had to leave to do something, he said, taking in a shaky breath. He closed his eyes and massaged his temples. Each time I say that, I promise myself that the next time Zephyr asks me, I'll tell her the truth. But it's always too difficult for me. I can only imagine her reaction if she found out. I can't do it to her, Gobber. Not yet, at least. I will, one day, but it's still not the time. She was close to you, he asked, receiving himself a confused look from Hiccup. She was the mother of my only child, he replied. There was no trace of his previous joy in his voice. That should answer your question. What was her name? The old blacksmith queried, looking him in the eyes. He saw the similarities between Hiccup and Stoic at that moment. He would always recognize that pain. I'm sorry, Gobber, but I don't want to talk about her, Hiccup replied, sighing heavily. It's still difficult, even after all these years. I understand, he commented hesitantly, not really knowing what to say. It was killing him to see the man, who used to be like a son to him, in such a state. We should call it a day, Hiccup declared, pushing himself off from the counter. The sun is already setting, and I've promised Zephyr I would spend some time with her today. If you decide to come tomorrow, I'll tell you about the other places I've visited, Constantinople, Rome, Paris, an uninhabited land in the west. I've seen a lot of places during my travels. I will come, Gobber agreed. I prefer working in the forge than on the repairs. And I'd gladly hear what you've been up to when you've disappeared. I'm glad to hear it, Hiccup replied with a smile. I've missed you, Gobber, he muttered slightly. Once again that day, the young man found himself locked in a tight embrace. This time, though, he could breathe properly. He returned the hug, although a little awkwardly. I've missed you too, boy, the old blacksmith replied, still mesmerized that Hiccup was alive. And that he was a chief and a father nonetheless. But remember, Hiccup said, sneaking away from the man's strong arms. Don't tell Stoic about me. I promise I'll tell him myself, but I have to prepare myself for that. And try to convince him to my offer, he pleaded. Gobber nodded his head. I'll try, the old blacksmith promised. Don't take too long, though. Your father has to know. He has every right to learn that you're still alive, Hiccup. I'll try, he replied with a small smile. With that, the duo left the forge. Hiccup picked up his hooded robe, already feeling the chill of the evening. Hiccup called Toothless and Zephyr, who were still pacing around the plain. Irette was already long gone, probably with Kamikaze. Gobber jumped a little when the Night Fury suddenly appeared next to him. He couldn't help but smile, though, when he noticed a happy expression on the little girl's face. You're not afraid to leave her alone with a dragon? Gobber asked the young man, still eyeing the Night Fury carefully. No, he replied immediately. As I told you 2 days ago, I trust every dragon on my island. Besides, Toothless has saved my life more times than I can count, and I'm pretty sure he wouldn't do anything less when it comes to Zephyr, Hiccup explained, patting his friend on the snout. The Night Fury let out a sound similar to a happy purr. I must leave you here, he said when they reached the place where stone stairs were leading downwards. They both could see that the rest of the Burkians were slowly clearing up after their work. You wouldn't want your chief to think that you've become friends with the greatest traitor the Vikings have ever known, he added with a small smirk. Gobber sighed heavily at that. Yeah, he said, stroking his mustache. You've said that Astrid knows about you, he asked just as Hiccup was about to turn around and leave. No, he replied. I've only said that she was with me when I discovered the nest. But I'm pretty sure she has recognized me. Why? That would explain why she's so hostile towards you, Gobber commented under his breath. It's just too much for me to take it all in at once. You know, you being alive and stuff. I think it will be easier for me to process it if I had someone else to talk to about it. I understand, Hiccup replied, nodding his head in agreement. I know you all too well to hope that you wouldn't say a word to anyone, so you can speak with her about me if you want. Just make sure that no one hears you, okay? I'm not really in a mood to deal with all of you guys. I promise I'll be discreet, Gobber replied and began hobbling down the stairs. Gobber! Hiccup called out after him before the old blacksmith could go too far. His old mentor turned around to face him again. Thank you, for everything. It felt good working with you again, he said, smiling gently. The pleasure's all mine, Hiccup, Gobber replied, returning the smile. Or, should I say, Chief Hiccup, he added with a small chuckle and turned around, continuing his hobbling down the stairs. Chief Hiccup, dear Thor, he muttered more to himself, though the young man heard him clearly. His smile grew even wider. He turned around as well, ready to spend the rest of the day with Zephyr, teaching her how to ride on a dragon's back. Did you see Iron Toothless today, Daddy? The little girl asked ecstatically. Hiccup couldn't help but chuckle after noticing how excited his daughter was. Of course I did, sweetheart, he replied, lifting her from Toothless' back. He spun her around a couple of times, holding her firmly. Zephyr laughed a little, enjoying the wind that was ruffling her hair. You were doing so great today, he praised her when he stopped spinning. You're getting better and better at staying in the saddle. Will you let me fly tomorrow? She asked hopefully, looking him straight in the eyes. I've promised you that, haven't I? He replied with a question of his own, earning himself a confirmative nod from his daughter. And, as you should know, I'm a man of my word. I always keep my promises. So yes, I'll take you for a flight tomorrow in the morning, Hiccup informed her. Zephyr exclaimed victoriously before she had been placed back on the ground. But this will have to wait until tomorrow. Let's give Toothless a break, even dragons need to rest from time to time, he said, receiving a thankful growl from the Night Fury. He chuckled slightly after hearing it. So, do you want to see what I've been working on in the forge today, he offered. Yes, Zephyr replied, nodding her head a few times. Hiccup took her hand and led her to the place where he's been working with Gobber for a few hours. Be careful not to touch the weapons, he warned her when they entered the forge. Zephyr looked cautiously around, taking in her surroundings. She visited that place very often, always under the watchful eye of her father, but it still didn't stop to mesmerize her. Come here, Hiccup said to her, removing her from some sort of trance she was in. Zephyr shook her head a few times and ran up to him, standing right beside him. Look, he said, showing her the wooden box that was filled with dirt. His daughter looked curiously inside. Amongst the dirt, two circular, golden objects were placed, shining brightly, illuminated by the light of the torches. Zephyr examined the two products carefully, seeing such things for the first time in her life. What are those? She asked. Hiccup removed one of the objects with his fingers. The gold was already cold, and it was formed almost perfectly. They are called rings, Hiccup informed her, holding the object right in front of her eyes. Irette asked me to make them because he and Aunt Cammy will need them in 2 weeks. Why? Zephyr asked, examining the small circular jewelry. Because they'll be getting married, Hiccup informed her, allowing his daughter to hold one of the rings. And these will be the symbols of their marriage. What is a marriage? Zephyr asked, looking up from the ring. Hiccup smiled at her, sitting right next to her on one of the chairs. How do I explain it? He asked himself, rubbing his beard. Marriage is a form of bonding, he began hesitantly. It binds together a man and a woman who love each other very much so that they can be together for the rest of their lives, and even later, in Valhalla. They promise each other that they will always be side by side, even if everything around them works against them. Will I ever get married? Zephyr asked hopefully. Her eyes were shining brightly out of excitement, they were the perfect copy of Hiccup's own green orbs. Of course you will, sweetheart, he replied with a smile, ruffling her hair once again. When you're older, that is. Can I marry you? She asked, looking him straight in the eyes. What? He asked after he regained control over his voice. Her question left him speechless for a few seconds. You've said that if two people love each other very much, they get married, Zephyr replied, surprised that she had to explain such an obvious thing to her father. I love you, and I know that you love me too, so isn't that a good reason? No, darling, Hiccup replied, smiling gently. He shook his head, finally understanding what his daughter meant. Marriage is taken between two people who aren't a family already. So, that excludes us, he explained as simply as he could. But you will get married one day, I can promise you that. When you meet the man you will want to spend the rest of your life with, that is. But I want to be with you, she protested with a sad look on her face. Hiccup chuckled again. For now, you do. But there will come a time when you won't want to be with me all the time, and you'll want to have another man in your life, he said, patting her on the shoulder. Come now, let's get a dinner. Underscore 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 underscore. Did you learn anything? Stoic asked Gobber when the guards have escorted them back to prison. The old blacksmith nodded his head slowly. A little, he replied. But nothing valuable. To be honest, he added, not believing that it was so easy for him to lie to his best friend. Any information is better than none, Stoic countered. So, what did you learn? He repeated the question. Gobber noticed that other hooligans were also listening carefully, though they kept a respectful distance. Actually, you have some things in common, he began. Stoic immediately reacted with a burst of humorless laughter after hearing his words. I have nothing in common with that traitor, the chief of Berk replied. You do, Gobber countered. For example, both of you are chiefs. And, Both of you are widowers, apparently, he added carefully, knowing well that it was a sensitive topic for Stoic. With the corner of his eye, Gobber noticed that Astrid raised her head at that. A widower? Stoic asked, making sure if heard correctly. Yes, Gobber confirmed. The man we've seen during the night, Dager, had killed his wife years ago. And there is one more thing, Stoic. What is it? He offered to help us but not go with us to the Helheim's Gate. Then what is his offer? Stoic queried, crossing his arms on his giant chest. He said that he can trade with us if you agree to form an alliance with him, Gobber explained. His chief immediately rolled his eyes at that. He also said that he can help us make it back to Berk once we're done here, but we would be forced to ride on the dragons. He'll never see the day, Stoic countered. You will sooner see Ragnarok than me on the back of a dragon. I know, Stoic, I know. It's just he asked me to propose his offer to you, Gobber said, attempting to calm his chief down and make him see the reason in it. He was aware that it would be a futile attempt, but he had to try. I'll never form an alliance with that man, Gobber Stoic said through gritted teeth. These beasts murdered my entire family, and now he expects me to just forget it. Not forget it, Gobber countered. Not the entire family, Stoic, he added in his mind. He just offered that he would help us with our problems by trading with us if you allied with him. That is not an option, Stoic declared. Are you going to go with him to the forge tomorrow as well? From what I understood, yes, Gobber replied, nodding his head. Good, Stoic commented. Then, if you have the opportunity to do so, I want you to kill him, he ordered, whispering the last sentence, afraid that one of the guards might have heard him. Gobber was staring at him with wide eyes. You've heard me correctly, Stoic said, understanding the unasked question. I'll try, Gobber muttered when he regained control over his voice. Oh, Stoic, if only you knew, he said to himself, sighing heavily. I think I'll call it a day, he added. There was a lot of stuff to do today in the forge, he explained, excusing himself. Stoic nodded his head, allowing his friend to walk away. Gobber hobbled towards Astrid. He chuckled when he realized that his bed was right next to hers. It had to be a coincidence or God's will. He sat heavily on the furs, letting out a tired sigh. We need to talk, he muttered to her, doing his best not to be overheard by anyone else from their group. Chapter 13. When the sun rose in the east, Hiccup has nearly been thrown off the bed. Before his eyes allowed him to open them, all he could hear was Zephyr's excited clamoring, ordering him to get up. He felt his daughter jumping up and down on his bed, doing her best to wake him up. He sighed heavily, trying to ignore her and get a few more precious minutes of sleep. Unfortunately for him, the little girl wasn't patient, and she would have none of it. Wake up, she repeated excitingly, grabbing Hiccup's hand. She attempted to drag him out of the bed, not allowing him to fall back to sleep. It's too early, Hiccup protested weakly, muttering those words. He still kept his eyes shut, hoping that the blissful unconsciousness would claim him once again. The young man pulled his hand from Zephyr's tight grip and turned around under the covers, facing Zephyr with his back. You promised that you would take me for a flight today, she countered, once again hopping on the bed. She tried to remove the covers, but Hiccup was gripping the fur tightly, refusing to have it taken away from him. But being the daughter of one of the most stubborn Vikings in the entire archipelago caused Zephyr to inherit some of those traits. She wouldn't be easily denied what she wanted. She huffed loudly, making sure that her father heard her dissatisfaction with his behavior. That was all the warning Hiccup got before he was kicked off of his bed unceremoniously. The young chief hit the wooden floor with a soft thud, followed by a muffled groan. Accepting that he wouldn't be able to get any more sleep, Hiccup lifted himself from the ground, wiping his face. He looked at his bed where he had been a few seconds before. Zephyr was standing on the furs, already dressed to go out. She had a large grin on her face, and she was still jumping up and down out of excitement. Hiccup couldn't help but smile at that. No matter what his daughter would do, he couldn't possibly be mad at her for longer than a few seconds. He shook his head, not bothering himself to suppress the yawn that escaped his lips. Okay, go downstairs, you little vermin, Hiccup said with a chuckle, ruffling Zephyr's hair. Despite the mean comment, the little girl's smile grew wider, recognizing the affectionate tone in her father's voice. I'll put on something and will join you in a minute, he added, urging her to leave his room. Don't take too long, Dad, she said as she left him alone, closing the door behind her. Hiccup sighed once again and began changing his clothes. He threw his nightshirt on the bed and put on a simple black tunic made out of wool. Usual clothing was much more comfortable than his armor, and it was easier to put them on. After putting on the pants and boots, Hiccup left his room, once again wiping his face to get rid of the remnants of sleep that were still holding him in a tight grasp. He walked downstairs, hearing Zephyr talking to Toothless. Hiccup smiled again after seeing his daughter trying to wake the Night Fury as she did him. The Black Dragon was also reluctant to start the day, ignoring the little girl. Hiccup laughed when he saw his best friend covering its snout with the tail. Zephyr huffed angrily at that, though she wasn't trying to throw the Night Fury off the rock slab. Maybe eating breakfast first would be a good idea, Hiccup suggested, joining his daughter in their main room. I'm not hungry, Zephyr protested immediately, attempting to drag Toothless off of the rock slab. The Night Fury growled at her, attempting to scare her off so he could continue sleeping. But growing with the dragon all her life made it impossible for Zephyr to be afraid of Toothless. She continued nagging at him, pulling the dragon's front paw. Not everyone is afraid of you, but Hiccup commented with a chuckle, joining his daughter at the Night Fury's side. He patted his best friend on the snout. Come on, we'll fly a bit, and you will be able to sleep some more, he said, trying to reason with the black dragon. The young chief also received a quiet growl from Toothless. Come on, you overgrown lizard, Hiccup said, attempting to wake the dragon up. There will be an extra fish for you after the flight, he added. He wasn't surprised to see the Night Fury lift its head after hearing his words, but still, he failed to suppress a chuckle that escaped his lips. Sometimes it was much easier to convince Toothless to do something than it seemed to be. The Night Fury stood up lazily, still a little groggy. It shook its body in an attempt to wake up fully. Breakfast, Hiccup announced, tossing a fish towards Toothless. Even sleepy, the dragon had no problem with catching the food. While it was too little to satisfy the Night Fury's hunger, it was enough to wake the dragon up properly. Let's go, Zephyr exclaimed happily, catching Hiccup's arm and dragging him outside their house. Hiccup laughed again and allowed his daughter to lead him through the door, grabbing his and Zephyr's cloak. Toothless followed them after eating a few more fish from the barrel. Even though he was displeased to be woken up so abruptly, he couldn't deny his love for flying. It was much stronger than his desire to sleep. Hiccup pulled the furred cloak over his shoulders and did the same to his daughter. He pulled the hood over her head, blinding her for a few seconds. He used that short time to tickle her on her sides, earning himself a burst of a giggle from the small girl. He ruffled her hair once again when she removed the hood. Come here, Hiccup said, picking Zephyr up. He placed her on Toothless' back and positioned himself right behind his daughter, not bothering himself with the safety harness. Keep your hands here, he ordered, placing Zephyr's arms on the reins. The little girl did as she had been told, trembling slightly both out of fear and excitement. Hiccup put his legs on the stirrups, preparing himself to soar into the sky. Go gently, but he told his best friend. It is Zephyr's first day of flying, he reminded him. The black dragon purred slightly as if it wanted to assure them that he understood. Hiccup patted Toothless' side, signalizing that they were ready. No matter how gentle the Night Fury tried to be, it was impossible to get airborne calmly. The first few seconds were filled with Zephyr's terrified scream as they were flying higher and higher. Hiccup reacted instantly, embracing his daughter from behind and placing his hands on top of hers on the reins. He pressed his beard against her shoulder, doing his best to keep her steady. Her eyes were closed, and she leaned backward, pressing herself against Hiccup as much as she possibly could. Though it lasted only for a few seconds, to Zephyr it seemed like an eternity before Toothless leveled his flight. She still refused to open her eyes, afraid that if she did so, the Night Fury would stop flying gently. Hiccup felt her squeezing her hands even tighter. Darling, open your eyes, he spoke softly, placing one of his hands on Zephyr's abdomen, reassuring her that he was right beside her. Remember what I had told you yesterday about being afraid, Hiccup reminded her, pressing his lips against her ear. Besides, Toothless and I are here, nothing is going to happen to you, I promise, he added, muttering those words into Zephyr's ear, gently caressing her hair. Hesitantly, the little girl opened her eyes and gasped almost immediately. Although the strong wind was forcing her to squint, Zephyr was doing her best to keep her eyes open after seeing the world from a dragon's perspective for the first time. She felt her father pulling the hood over her head in an attempt to block the wind away. Hiccup smiled softly after hearing her reaction at what he had shown her. They were flying as slow as they could without risking falling down. Toothless wings were spread wide, moving from time to time to maintain their altitude. From their current position, they could clearly see the sun rising in the east, slowly increasing its distance from the horizon. If they focused enough, they could even make out the shapes of the Scandinavian mountains. Zephyr risked glancing below them, leaning to her left. She saw miles upon miles of dark waves of the sea that were foaming up here and there. Having seen the ocean only from the cliffs of Driki, she was surprised at how vast it actually was. She looked around, attempting to find the borders of seemingly infinite blue mass, though there was none. Zephyr leaned to the right, hoping to find it on the other side, though she failed at that again. The sea seemed to have no end. "Look up," Hiccup whispered to her, breaking her out of her state of fascination. It took Zephyr a few seconds to register what he had said, but when she did, she complied with his words and gasped once again. They were closer to the clouds than she had ever dreamed to be. "Lift your hand," Hiccup urged her on, releasing one of his palms from the reins, freeing her arm. Zephyr raised her left hand hesitantly, slightly afraid of breaking the cloud's structure. She glanced back at her father. Recognizing the question in her eyes, Hiccup nodded his head encouragingly. Reassured by his gesture, Zephyr raised her arm higher, finally reaching the cloud. She gasped once again, surprised that she felt no resistance when breaking the white layer above her head. "It's cold," she commented simply, looking at the thin clouds mesmerized. "And wet," she added after a moment of wondering. She drew back her hand and examined her fingers closely. They were covered with small droplets of water. "It is the rain," Hiccup informed her, still smiling at his daughter's reaction. "Then why is it not falling down?" she asked, turning around to look at her dad. "I don't know," Hiccup admitted without shame. "Perhaps it's waiting for the right moment," he suggested. "So, what do you think?" he asked her after a moment of silence. Toothless continued flying steadily. "It's amazing," she replied immediately without even thinking about her response. Her eyes were pacing back and forth between the layer of clouds and the sea below them. Zephyr couldn't decide which sight impressed her more. It seemed that the entire world was covered with two blue plains, one far above them and one beneath them. "How big is it?" she asked, looking at the dark waters of the sea. "Too big to really comprehend it," sweetheart, Hiccup informed her. "Years ago, I had traveled far beyond the archipelago, and the sea was still there. Of course, at some point, it moves over, allowing the land to take its place. But still, it returns. I've encountered only one land that I think has no sea beyond it, far to the south." "And what's even further to the south?" Zephyr queried, looking at him with interest in her eyes. She always enjoyed listening to the stories of her father's travels, and it seemed that she still hadn't heard the entirety of his stories. "I didn't go further," Zephyr Hiccup replied, looking her straight in the eyes. "But from what I've heard from other people, beyond that land is the edge of the world. Unfortunately, I hadn't been there to confirm it or deny it, though." Hiccup urged Toothless to go lower. The Night Fury complied silently, lowering their altitude, heading steadily towards the sea. It wasn't a sharp dive that the dragon would do if it flew only with the chief of Driki. It was a gentle descent, almost unnoticeable, and the only thing that signalized they were approaching the water were the clouds that remained above their heads, steadily getting more and more distant from them. Toothless leveled the flight, not allowing the cold waters to reach them. Zephyr leaned to the side once again, observing the sea from a much closer distance. Her eyes widened when she noticed a shoal of fish under the waves. The small animals were swimming effortless as the dragons were flying in the skies without a struggle. At a glance, one could say that their movements were chaotic, but, after a closer inspection, Zephyr realized that there was an order in what the fish were doing. The young girl straightened herself back up, still observing the world around her. It never seemed so large from Driki. She felt Hiccup placing her hand back on the reins. Her father slowly withdrew his arms from her palms, but he still was holding her tightly, not allowing her to slide off of Toothless' back. "Where do you want to go?" he asked her, signalizing that he was giving her control over the course of their flight. Zephyr's eyes widened at that, just as her fingers clenched tighter around the small wooden handles. She turned around once again to look at her father. Hiccup smiled at her, understanding the unspoken question that was written all over her face. "I've told you I would teach you how to ride on a dragon, right? Well, this is your first real lesson. You just move the reins in which direction you want to go, and Toothless will take you there," he told her. The Night Fury growled quietly as if wanting to confirm his rider's words. Hesitantly, Zephyr turned the reins to the left. Toothless reacted immediately, sensing the movement of the small mechanism. Hiccup flipped the position in the artificial fin instinctively, following the dragon's moves. While the reins didn't control the Night Fury in any way, they provided a much better exchange of information between the rider and the dragon, not forcing them to rely on Hiccup's voice commands. As the result of Zephyr's actions, the trio turned around in the air, causing Dreeky to be right in front of them, though much further than the little girl anticipated. She gasped slightly, surprised at what she had seen. "Is that home?" she asked, barely able to force out the words that got stuck in her throat. Hiccup chuckled at that, hugging her even tighter. "It is," he confirmed, also observing the tiny dot that was their island. "Want to see it from above?" he suggested as they were slowly flying back towards their home. Zephyr only nodded at that, still unable to find words. "Then let Toothless know that we want to go up," he said, patting her hand. Even though Hiccup knew that the Night Fury had heard him, he wanted his daughter to do that by herself. The small girl did as she was told and turned the reins upward. Once again, Toothless reacted immediately, ascending once again towards the clouds. Hiccup was controlling the movements of the dragon's tail. After 10 years of flying together, he didn't need to even think about it. Zephyr began laughing as the wind forced the hoods off of their heads as they were steadily increasing the distance between themselves and the sea. They were going upward almost vertically. Hiccup was pleased to see that there was no trace of Zephyr's fear and only excitement remained. He recognized it well. He had also felt it during his first true flight on Toothless' back amongst the sea stacks near Berk. Once they've returned to the layer of clouds, Toothless once again leveled his flight, heading steadily towards their home. Zephyr observed, still mesmerized, as the individual houses in the village of Dreeky were growing bigger and bigger, even though, from their perspective, they still remained as small as ants. But as they were approaching the island, more and more shapes could have been distinguished. Zephyr was watching intensively the small dots that were moving around villagers and dragons alike. She noticed that some of the people were preparing themselves to fly with their dragons as well, whether in order to go on a patrol or to simply relax. Others would go fishing, using the last gentle days of the early winter. Once the storms began, there would be no way for any of them to go flying above the sea. "They are so small!" Zephyr exclaimed with a burst of laughter that was mimicked by Hiccup. He nodded his head in agreement. Hiccup smiled with content after he stopped laughing. Everything that concurred to his everyday life was anything but what he expected when he was leaving Berk or when he decided to return to the archipelago after spending 5 years in Europe. He couldn't complain, though. His current life was much more than he could have ever wished for. Even though creating a village, and being its chief, had never been his goal, Hiccup had to admit that he was pleased with how things turned out for him and his people. And even though the circumstance of all of them coming together wasn't pleasant, the consequences of those events were. He still couldn't fully comprehend how he had managed to make so many Vikings see the world from his point of view. And though it was true that some of his people were still cautious around the dragons, more and more of the villagers were deciding to live with them. It was like a dream he had never had coming true. His greatest desire that he never dared to form in his mind was becoming a reality before his very eyes. An idea that seemed to be too ridiculous and too absurd to be real was his daily bread now. And while Hiccup knew that most likely he wouldn't be there to witness a complete symbiosis of Vikings and dragons, he was more than sure that his daughter would be able to see it or her children after her. He flew with her for a few more minutes above the village before urging Toothless to land next to their house. Even though he had received a moan of disappointment from his daughter, he couldn't spend the entire day flying with her and his Night Fury. He had to make sure that his village was well prepared for the winter, and he had to show up at the forge at some point. Hiccup was sure that Gobber was already waiting there for him. Hiccup urged his daughter to accompany him while he inspected their livestock and grain supplies for the winter. The young chief smiled under his nose. The harvest this year was extremely generous. During their inspection, Hiccup informed Zephyr that it was important for her to learn to perform those activities as they would one day become her responsibility. When she asked him what he meant, he only replied by telling her that she would understand one day. Satisfied with the supplies in their granaries and barns, Hiccup went to the forge. Zephyr and Toothless followed him instantly. The black dragon knew that its rider would need its help, and the little girl just wanted to spend more time with her father. Hiccup made no attempt at stopping his daughter from following him. After all, it wouldn't be the first time she would accompany him in the forge. Torloff, one of the guards under Steinar's command, was guarding the entrance to the forge. It could only mean that Gobber was already there. Hiccup acknowledged him with a nod of his head and ordered him to return to the rest of the Burkians, reassuring him that he would be all right. Although reluctantly, Torloff agreed and complied with the command. "I see you haven't changed that much after all," Gobber commented when he saw Hiccup entering the forge. The old blacksmith stiffened visibly after noticing that the Night Fury entered the building as well. The dragon eyed the Viking suspiciously and growled slightly. Gobber took a small step backward. "Of all people, you should know that I'm not the one to show up at the forge too early," Hiccup replied with a chuckle, patting Toothless on the snout, reassuring his best friend that everything was fine. The Night Fury calmed down a bit, feeling the man's touch. "And running the village gives a little more responsibilities than I used to have as your apprentice," he added, removing the cloak from his shoulders. "Yeah, like flying on a dragon," Gobber replied, still eyeing the Night Fury carefully. "Exactly," Hiccup agreed with a chuckle. "And the preparations for the winter, Snoggletok, my second-in-command's marriage and so on. Also, I have to prepare my daughter to take over me one day. Which reminds me," he added, stepping aside, revealing the small girl who was standing behind him, eyeing the old blacksmith cautiously. Zephyr wasn't the one to trust strangers easily. "I haven't introduced you to her yet," he finished with a small smile, kneeling next to his daughter. Only then, Gobber had a proper chance of examining Hiccup's girl closely. After a closer inspection, he realized that the only similarities between her and his former apprentice were the colors of hair and the eyes, but her face wasn't Hiccup's. It surprised the old blacksmith to see that she was less afraid than she used to be the previous day. This time, her orbs were also filled with curiousness. "Zephyr, I want you to meet my old friend," Gobber Hiccup spoke, introducing his former mentor. "He's the one who taught me almost everything about being a blacksmith I know, and I think it's fair to say that he practically was my uncle," he said, smiling softly. "Almost," Gobber commented, not believing his ears. "I've taught you everything," he corrected the young chief. "I've managed to learn plenty of stuff myself," Hiccup countered, continuing to smile. "He might look scary, I admit it, but actually, he's even more gentle than Toothless," he said, directing those words to his daughter. Zephyr was looking from Gobber to the Night Fury as if she was judging whether Hiccup's words were actually true. After a moment of consideration, she allowed herself to trust him. After all, her father had never lied to her. "Hello," she whispered hesitantly. Gobber felt his lips curling up in a smile. He mimicked Hiccup's actions and knelt as well. Or, at least, he tried to do that as much as his stump allowed him. He reached out with his healthy hand, offering it to the young girl. The old blacksmith felt his heart leap into his throat when he noticed that Zephyr inherited more than just the hair and the eyes from Hiccup. Even if it had been over a decade, Gobber would always recognize that uncertain expression that the little girl had on her face. He recalled the day, nearly 20 years before, when Hiccup was brought to him to become his apprentice. Zephyr accepted the offered hand, still a little uncertain, though Gobber's wide smile seemed to calm her down a bit. The old blacksmith shook her palm as gently as he could, introducing himself in the process. He couldn't believe how small her hand actually was. He could cover it entirely only with his fingers and still have plenty of space between his digits. And just as it was the case 20 years before with Hiccup, Gobber instantly fell in love with the little girl. He caught himself wondering if he would be able to see the little lass grow up into an adult. It would give him an opportunity to witness what he failed at with his former apprentice. Hiccup was smiling widely from ear to ear, observing the interaction between his daughter and his former mentor. It was only then that he realized how much he actually missed Gobber. Years of traveling and more adventures than one could count have somehow managed to push his old feelings aside, but they have resurfaced with full strength at that moment. He hadn't known it until then that deep down he had always wanted to see his children interacting with the man who was his uncle in every aspect of that word, other than blood. It was even fair to say that he was his second father. The magic of the moment was interrupted when a small green shape burst into the forge, causing Hiccup to fall to the ground. Toothless got into a defensive state immediately, growling menacingly at the intruder, ready to rip it into pieces. The only thing that stopped him from doing it was Hiccup's laughter. The young chief was still lying on the forge's floor, attacked by the small dragon's licks. He raised his hands in self-defense, attempting to stop the onslaught. He succeeded after a few seconds, finally removing the terrible terror from his chest. Even after being forced to live in the village that provided shelter to the dragons, Gobber was still staring at his former apprentice with wide eyes. It was the first time he witnessed a dragon acting like a puppy towards a human. Zephyr, on the other hand, seemed not to be affected by the sudden appearance of the small terrible terror. The old blacksmith guessed that it was due to her growing up with the dragons wherever she looked. "We really have to work on your landing," Sharpshot Hiccup spoke after standing up and placing the terrible terror on the counter. Only then did he notice that the small dragon had a rolled parchment attached to one of its hind legs. He untied it, receiving a not that painful bite on his fingers from Sharpshot. He shook his hand a few times, bringing his digits into his mouth. He sucked away a droplet of blood that appeared on his index finger. Hiccup unrolled the scroll, reading the message he had received. "What is it?" Gobber asked as he was looking at the young chief whose eyes were consuming the lines of runes on the paper. "It seems that Eret has taken care of what I have forgotten to do," he replied, continuing to read the letter. "The bog burglars will be arriving for the Snoggletog," Hiccup announced, finishing the message. "Why?" Gobber couldn't help but ask, looking between Hiccup and the terrible terror. "Because Bertha's daughter is getting married," he explained, rolling back the piece of paper. "Cammy and Eret will be tying the knot in 2 weeks, and the chieftain of the bog burglars can't allow herself not to be here to witness it." "So she knows about you and the dragons?" Gobber asked him, processing the information he had just received. Hiccup nodded his head, urging Toothless to start the fire in the hearth. The Night Fury released a steady stream of fire, igniting the coals and logs. "She never mentioned it to Stoic," Gobber commented, rubbing his chin. "Even though she is his ally." "Because I've asked her not to do it," Hiccup explained, using the blower to keep the fire going. "I knew that if my father knew about us, he would visit us immediately. And I wasn't, and I'm still not, ready for it. It turns out I've only delayed the inevitable." He muttered the last sentence, directing those words more to himself. "Speaking of which, I think you should talk to him soon," Gobber said, recalling his conversation with Stoic from the previous evening. Hiccup looked at him, sighing heavily. "I've told you that I'll do it when I'm ready, Gobber," he replied. "And I don't know when that will happen, to be honest." "You might want to do it as soon as possible," Hiccup the old blacksmith countered, resting his back against the counter. "And why is that?" "Better sit down, lad," Gobber said. Hiccup didn't fail to notice that there was no trace of his previous smile on his face anymore. Chapter 14. Hiccup was staring at Gobber with wide eyes, holding the casting mold that contained 2 rings for Eret and Kamikaze. The old blacksmith was still leaning against the counter, facing him without a trace of a smile on his features. His eyes were traveling from Hiccup's face to the floor and back again. Zephyr was observing her father and his guest without a full understanding of what she had just heard. Toothless' pupils narrowed into thin stripes, and his growling returned. Gobber took a few steps sideways, trying to increase the distance between himself and the Night Fury. Hiccup shushed his dragon immediately, though it still continued observing Gobber, waiting for the smallest sign of aggression from the old blacksmith's side. "You're kidding, right?" Hiccup asked him with a humorless chuckle, finally breaking the silence. The only response he received was sadness written all over Gobber's face, mixed with shame and guilt. The small, nervous smile faded slowly away from the young chief's lips. He felt the blood escaping from his face, causing it to become unnaturally pale. "Zephyr, why don't you go to the Great Hall with Toothless?" he said, addressing his daughter. "I could use a breakfast," he added, still looking at Gobber. His daughter nodded wordlessly, sensing the tension between the two adults, and walked out from the forge. She urged Toothless to follow her. The black dragon, however, didn't move a single muscle. "Go," Hiccup said, looking at the Night Fury. "I'll be fine." Although reluctantly, Toothless left the forge, following Zephyr. He let out one last growl directed at Gobber before the two men were left alone. Hiccup looked away from the door, casting his eyes at the old blacksmith. He shrugged his shoulders uncomfortably. "So," he asked hesitantly. "Are you going to do that?" he whispered, feeling a lump forming in his throat. He gulped loudly, trying to get rid of it. "What?" Gobber asked with a frown. "You won't get a better chance at this," Hiccup clarified, almost failing not to stutter. He cleared his throat. "And, from what I understood, it was a direct order from your chief. And you think I would obey it?" Gobber queried, pushing himself off from the counter. "While knowing what I know. And what difference does it make?" To Stoic, I mean," Hiccup clarified, failing to call the chief of Berk his father. "Are you serious, Hiccup?" Gobber asked, looking at him as if he had grown out a second head. "You are his son," he reminded him, causing the young chief to look down at his feet. "If only you told him the truth. I can assure you that his behavior will change." "Really?" Hiccup countered with a snort. "He never listened to me, Gobber. I don't see why he would do it now. Besides, how do you suggest I tell him that, he asked, his voice was practically dripping with sarcasm. "Should I go down there, right now, and be like, 'Hey, Dad, Gobber said you want me dead'? Or maybe I should invite him to dinner? What do you say?" he asked rhetorically with another humorless chuckle. "It would give him a perfect opportunity to do it himself. I know he never listened to you, Hiccup, and he hated himself for that every day for the past 10 years. Gobber exclaimed, refusing to be outshouted by the younger man. The chief of Dreeki snorted again, shaking his head in disbelief. "I've known your father my whole life, Hiccup, and I know that he's like that only because he sees dragons as his greatest enemies. They took Valka from him, and he believes that they've killed you as well. The only reason why he asked me to, is that he hates the dragons, but if you revealed to him that you're alive, he would change immediately, I can assure you of that." "Don't call that man my father," Hiccup replied venomously, keeping his hands crossed tightly on his chest. "Because he's not. I know what kind of a man my father was. He was the most honorable, the noblest, and the bravest Viking I've ever known, and by no means was he a murderer," he clarified. "I don't know who truly is that man you've come here with, but I can assure you that he's not my father." Hiccup yelled angrily, trembling from time to time. "All right, you may not know who Stoic is," Gobber agreed, scratching his chin. "But I do, because I've been there with him for the past 10 years, Hiccup. He is the man who had lost his entire family and is on the verge of losing his entire village," he explained, yelling as well. "Try to picture yourself in his situation, Hiccup. Let's take Dager and his berserkers, for example. Imagine that you've lost not only your wife, but Zephyr as well because of that man, and you've been trying to kill that son of a bitch for most of your life, but he would always slip away from your grasp. And then, you find out that there are some rogue berserkers that are actually able to help you capture and kill Dager. You go to them, asking for help, only to be imprisoned by them, while Dager is a constant threat to your village, and you doubt that you would see your people again once they let you go. What would you do in that situation?" "If I knew I was going to ask the berserkers for help," Hiccup replied with a shaky breath, carefully choosing his words. "I wouldn't have attacked a single one of them," he added, looking Gobber straight in the eyes. And even though his words had the desired effect, seeing as the old blacksmith looked down in shame, Hiccup had to admit that his former's mentor question was also well asked. If he lost Zephyr in one of Dager's attacks, the Blood Eagle would have seemed like a gentle scratch on the back, compared to what Hiccup would have done in the worst-case scenario. He looked down as well, examining his boots. "You're right," Gobber admitted with a heavy sigh. "It was stupid of us to attack that Nadder. But you must remember what life on Berk looks like. Dragon raids are a constant in our lives, and after each of their attacks, we're left with more casualties or with our livestock reduced. It's an instinct for us to act when we see a dragon, and you can't blame us for that. Besides, from what I've understood, we've barely scratched that Nadder and its rider," he added, trying to reason with Hiccup. The young chief snorted at that, tapping his foot against the wooden floor. It doesn't change anything, he countered. You have attacked us without any reason or provocation. Our laws couldn't be more precise about what should have been done in this case, and Stoic knows this, Hiccup said, looking Gobber angrily in the eyes. I'm sure that if our places had been reversed, I would have been long dead. And yet, I've given him a chance to atone for his actions, and I've even offered him an alliance. In turn, he spits in my face and orders you to kill me in my own house, he continued, trotting out, earning another sigh from Gobber. That's not the father I remember. Stoic had changed the moment that damn dragon took Valka away from him, Gobber replied, nodding his head in agreement. But he had managed to keep a cool head only because he still had you. And then, you've disappeared, and he believed that you were killed by a dragon as well. You're right that he's not the man you remember because something in him snapped the moment we had to accept the fact that you were gone, most likely dead. So once again, what would you have done if you were in his shoes, he asked, hoping that Hiccup would see the reason behind his words. The young man began pacing back and forth across the forge, scratching the back of his head. He was breathing in and out sharply, processing in his mind everything he had learned from his former mentor. He kicked a few loose objects that were lying on the floor, suddenly irritated by their unwanted presence. But no matter what he did, it was too much for him to process in one go. And what would you suggest me to do? Hiccup asked, although his voice was devoid of its previous rage. This time, it was resigned. He wiped his face, hoping that it would help him think clearly. It did not. I've told you already, Gobber replied, approaching his former student and placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. The old blacksmith wondered for a few seconds when have they doubled in size since the last time he saw Hiccup on Berk. Tell him the truth, show him you're alive. I can promise you that for Stoic, it will be as if you were born again. I still remember the day when he first held you in his arms. Never before have I seen him so happy. Well, maybe except for the day when he married your mother, Gobber added with a small chuckle that was mimicked by Hiccup. The smile quickly faded away from the younger man's lips, though. Too bad I don't remember the next time he was happy to see me, he muttered, once again looking down at his boots. That night in the forge right before Gothai had chosen him as the champion of the dragon training didn't count in his opinion. After all, it was based on a misunderstanding. I'll think about it, Gobber, he said louder, looking up from the floor. I just need some time to think about all this, he added, spreading his arms as if he wanted to point at something. Let's just get to work, shall we? I have to finish these rings before Snoggletalk, and I'm not getting any closer to it while we're just talking. I'll do my best to soften Stoic towards you a little, Gobber replied, agreeing to drop the topic. And haven't you finished those rings yesterday, he queried, looking inside the box that Hiccup placed at the table. In his opinion, the two objects were already perfect. Not exactly, Hiccup answered with a relieved sigh. He was glad that Gobber didn't decide to dwell on their previous conversation. First of all, Iret wants me to meld his and Kamikaze's dragon's scales and add them to the rings. He said it would be a nice touch. And second, I need to find a way to attach these two gemstones to these rings, he explained, pointing at the object he was referring to. They were lying scattered on the table, right where he had left them the previous day. Aren't the dragons fireproof actually because of their scales? Gobber asked with a deep groan, picking up one of the oval objects. He caressed it gently, marveling at its beauty. It resembled a larger gemstone he had once seen. He placed it back at the table, afraid of breaking the scale that looked as if it was going to fall apart if one wasn't careful with it. My thought exactly, Hiccup replied, also examining one of the scales, though he didn't seem to be nearly as cautious as Gobber. I've tried to tell it to him, but he wouldn't listen. Unfortunately for me, Iret is not a person who can be talked out of something easily. And that leaves me with a question, how to melt them down, he asked himself. I have some experience on working with dragon scales, but never before have I tried to do something like that. What do you mean? Gobber queried, clearly puzzled. The armors you've seen us wearing the other day are made out of our dragon's scales, Hiccup explained, still examining the small object. He rotated it a couple of times in his fingers. It works nicely when things are starting to heat up, he added, allowing himself to throw in a small pun. Gobber snickered slightly at that. I'm sure they do, he commented. Well, let's give it a try, Hiccup decreed, picking up tongs. He placed the green scale between the pincers and put it over the burning coals, even if he was almost certain that it would turn out to be a futile attempt. So, you spoke with Astrid, he asked, not wanting to have the forge filled with silence. He was rotating the tongs slowly, making sure to heat up each and every part of the scale. I did, Gobber confirmed, returning to his task from the previous day. He began dismantling a sword from the heap. Even though he had been able to take apart a rather large amount of weapons already, the stack was still quite big. And? Hiccup asked, urging him to continue. She had confirmed what you have said. You know, about the Helheim's Gate, he replied, earning a single hum from his former apprentice. Gobber sighed heavily, recalling Hiccup's description of the beast that was somewhere out there. Is it even possible for a dragon to be that big? I mean, Astrid said what you did, that she had seen it swallow a Gronkel, but it still seems unbelievable to me. It seems unbelievable to me too, even if I've already seen it a couple of times, Hiccup replied, not looking away from the scale he was holding above the coals. A couple of times? Gobber asked, sounding a little surprised. Yes, Hiccup confirmed. I've visited the nest more than once, though I'm not entirely sure why. I guess I can blame my own curiosity for that. I went there because I hoped to study that beast a little, get to know it better, you know. And each time I left with more question than answers, he added with a sigh. That's why I don't want to attack Helheim's Gate, Gobber. I just don't know what we would truly face. I understand, the old blacksmith replied. He placed the blade in the large bowl they've been using the previous day. Astrid wanted to speak to you, he said after a moment of silence. Taken by surprise by Gobber's words, Hiccup dropped the tongs into the hearth, cursing quietly. He reached out for it as quickly as possible, not allowing the tool to heat up too much. He blew a few times at the slightly warm handles. Did she say why? Hiccup asked, glad he wasn't facing his former mentor. He suddenly felt as if he was 15 years old again, and Astrid would just pass by the forge, not sparing him a single glance, even if Hiccup would follow her every movement with his eyes. He felt his cheeks heating up, and the heat of the hearth had nothing to do with that. No, Gobber replied, shaking his head. She only said that it's important to her. Well, maybe she had also received an order from Stoic to kill me, Hiccup murmured, bringing the scale out of the fire and lifting it so it could be closer to his eyes. The small object didn't have a single mark on itself that would indicate that the fire had somehow managed to do what Hiccup intended. Cautiously, he lifted his right hand, wanting to check if anything at all had actually happened to the scale. Hesitantly, he grabbed it with his thumb and index finger. He gasped slightly, though the reason for that was astonishment. He expected the object to be at least warm while it remained as cold as it had been when he picked it up from the table. It was as if the flames didn't even touch the dragon's scale. Hiccup huffed at that, though he knew that this most likely wouldn't have worked. I don't think so, Gobber replied, also watching the small object that Hiccup was holding with the tongs. Stoic didn't tell others what he said to me, he explained. Just as the young man, he was also surprised that the scale didn't allow the fire to cause any damage to itself after Hiccup was keeping it above the flames for a dozen or so minutes. But there again, she's Astrid, she can be unpredictable, he added with a slight chuckle. Hiccup laughed at that as well, and Gobber felt the knot in his chest loosen up a little. He regretted telling his former apprentice what Stoic had ordered him to do, but it wouldn't be fair to keep that information away from him, even if it broke his heart. Yeah, Hiccup agreed, approaching the terrible terror that found himself a comfortable spot on the counter and was attempting to get some sleep after flying all the way from the Bog Burglars Island. The young man caressed its hide gently, trying to wake Sharpshot up. The dragon stirred a little, lifting its head. Hiccup placed the scale in front of its snout, asking it to fire at the small object. The tiny creature complied, releasing a small torrent of flames. I'll have to make sure she's unarmed if I decide to speak to her, Hiccup added as the dragon was breathing fire at the scale. But I doubt even that would save me if she decided to kill me, he commented with a subtle smirk. Gobber laughed at that. After a few minutes of holding the scale in the flames, Hiccup retracted his hand, once again examining the small object. This time, it had been charred a little, a black layer was covering the green scale. He traced his finger against it, wiping away the dust. Just as before, the object was cold. Hiccup sighed heavily, throwing the tongs at the table, startling the terrible terror in the process. He had to wait for Toothless if he wanted to melt the scale down like that. As if on cue, the door to the forge was opened, revealing Toothless and Zephyr, who was holding a tray with food on it. The Night Fury was walking behind the little girl protectively, keeping its wings around Hiccup's daughter. The young chief smiled at that, taking the tray from Zephyr's hands with a small thanks. The little girl smiled at him and picked up one of the chicken wings. Hiccup did the same, bringing the food up to his mouth. He felt the fat from the meat running down from his lips and disappearing in his beard. "Are you hungry?" he asked, turning to Gobber. The old blacksmith only shook his head, explaining that the guards had brought them the breakfast before they led them out of the cells. Hiccup nodded at that, taking another bite. Toothless was still eyeing the old blacksmith warily, letting out a single growl every now and then, ready to pounce at the old blacksmith if he did anything reckless. Gobber gulped slightly after noticing that the dragon's intense gaze was focused on him. He looked at Hiccup, who seemed to be oblivious to the Night Fury's behavior. The young chief was leaning against the counter, holding the chicken wing with one hand and caressing Toothless' snout with the other. His actions seemed to calm the black dragon down a little. Gobber suddenly felt like an intruder, observing the interaction before father and daughter. The little girl was asking him numerous questions about flying on a dragon, which Hiccup was answering gladly. That's when the old blacksmith had noticed the main difference between his former student and Stoic. His chief rarely visited Hiccup in the forge back on Berk. Of course, he would come to Gobber many times, requiring his axe or his sword sharpened, his chainmail fixed, or to discuss the matters of the village. But even if he tried, he couldn't recall the time when Stoic came to talk to Hiccup as a father, not as the chief. As opposed to his father, Hiccup always seemed to find the time for his daughter, or at least tried to do it as often as possible. That's what Gobber had noticed, at least, during his short time in the village of Driki. He felt the lump forming in his throat as the realization struck him like thunder. Hiccup didn't want to be like Stoic. At least not when it came to being a father. Gobber never truly understood why Stoic seemed to distance himself more and more away from his son as Hiccup was growing up, focusing his attention on him almost only after the dragon raids, when another one of the young man's ideas have failed. Stoic would always tell his best friend that he was too busy running the village, and that's why he had made Hiccup his apprentice. Gobber would accept that explanation, but it crumbled to pieces at that moment. Hiccup had proved that it was possible to be a father and the chief at the same time, even without the help of a woman at his side. The lump in the old blacksmith's throat didn't loosen up. If anything, it became even bigger. What? Hiccup's question pulled Gobber out of his wondering. He shook his head a few times, doing his best to get rid of the unpleasant thoughts. He saw his former apprentice looking at him with a puzzled expression. Gobber wondered for a few seconds how long had he been staring at him. "Nothing," he replied, once again shaking his head. "It's just. I was remembering the old days," he added. Hiccup's expression darkened a little. "Should we continue our work?" Gobber offered after clearing his throat. "Right," Hiccup replied, pushing himself off of the counter. "So? I think you've said yesterday that you would tell me more about your travels," Gobber said, breaking the uncomfortable silence that took hold of the forge. At least it was uncomfortable for the old blacksmith. Hiccup didn't seem to mind about it. "Yeah, I forgot, sorry," he replied, remembering his promise. He took in a deep breath, picking up the tongs and the dragon's scale once again. "We've finished with my infamous getaway from Alexandria, right?" Hiccup asked, looking at Gobber. The older man nodded his head, smirking slightly. "After Egypt, I've crossed the Mediterranean Sea and headed north to a place known as Constantinople. Underscore 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 underscore. Hiccup sighed heavily as he placed Zephyr in the bed. Both he and his daughter were exhausted after a long day, and the little girl was almost asleep already. He brushed away a single strand of her hair that came loose from the braid. Zephyr smiled semi-consciously, turning her head slightly to the left, attempting to receive more affection from her father. Hiccup smirked a little, cupping her cheek and caressing it with his thumb. "What did that man mean, Dad?" Zephyr whispered, doing her best not to fall asleep yet. "What are you talking about?" Hiccup asked, not understanding her question. "When he said that someone wanted him to kill you," she explained softly, lifting her eyelids with great difficulty. Hiccup felt a pang in his chest. Of course, she was too small to know the meaning of that word, and it had been obvious that she would ask him about it. She always did when she didn't know something. "It means that someone wants to hurt me," he replied, not daring to say that Stoic wanted him dead. "Why?" "I'm not sure," Hiccup answered with a heavy sigh. "Who is that someone?" Zephyr queried, worried about her father. "A few years ago, he used to be my chief," Hiccup explained, not allowing himself to call Stoic his dad. "I think that he holds a grudge towards me for betraying him, I guess." "How did you betray him?" "I've become friends with his greatest enemy, the dragons," Hiccup answered, caressing Zephyr's cheek. "You see, not everyone in the archipelago is like us, sweetheart. Many people hate the dragons and us for siding with them." "But the dragons are amazing," she protested weakly. Hiccup smiled slightly. "I know, but not everyone sees it." "Is he one of those people you've said you didn't want to come back to?" Zephyr asked, recalling his words from a few days prior when she saw the Burkians for the first time. "Yes," Hiccup replied, gulping loudly. He cleared his throat a few times, doing his best not to get overwhelmed by the unpleasant thoughts. "But you're not going to allow him to hurt you, right?" "Never," Hiccup answered immediately. "I can assure you, darling, that man won't hurt me, nor you." Zephyr seemed to be pleased with her father's reply. She smiled widely and closed her eyes, lying on the side. Hiccup was still cupping her cheek, caressing it slightly with his finger. He couldn't help but smile as well. Seeing his daughter happy always worked miracles on his mood, no matter what he would feel in that moment. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered, fighting hopelessly against the sleep that was swallowing her more and more with each second. "I love you too," Hiccup whispered back with a wide smile. His heart would do a small somersault inside of his chest each time she said those words to him, and this time proved to be no different. At Maelti Minmir he started singing gently, still rubbing Zephyr's cheek with his thumb. At Muskildi Kappa, Flioke Fagra Ara, Fera Abrot Me Vikingum he recited the Old Norse song that always helped Zephyr to fall asleep faster. He wasn't sure if it was a necessity at that moment, but it had turned into his habit long ago. "Standa up I Stafni, Stiridium Neri, Haldas Vertil Hafna, Gvaman Okayanon, Gvaman Okayanon." He repeated the same song a few more times, observing his daughter. Zephyr's smile was slowly fading away from her lips, as she was becoming more and more sleepy with Hiccup's every word. After a third or fourth iteration of the song, the young chief was sure that his daughter was already asleep. He stood up from her bed carefully and left her room, closing the door behind him. Just as he expected, Toothless and Steinar were waiting for him in the main room. Hiccup nodded at the captain of the guard, wordlessly telling him that he was ready. Steinar only turned around and left his chief's house, heading towards the prison cells. Hiccup felt Toothless nudge him at the side comfortingly. The young man smiled at the affectionate gesture and embraced his closest friend, scratching him beneath the chin. The Night Fury purred happily at that. Hiccup sat down on the chair, waiting for Steinar to return with one of the Burkians. He was anxious, obviously. He didn't know what to expect from the incoming conversation and he wasn't entirely sure why he had decided to talk to that person. He sighed heavily, wiping his face with his hands. He prayed quickly to Thor to give him strength had it come to a fight. With yet another sigh, Hiccup straightened himself back up, attempting to relax his muscles. If he had managed to tame the unholy offspring of lightning and death itself, then he would also manage to go through with the conversation with Astrid. He only had to wait for Steinar to arrive with the woman he used to be in love with and, most probably, still was. Chapter 15. Even though she wasn't asleep yet, Astrid was startled when the silence of the prison cell had been broken by an echo of footsteps outside the wooden door, followed by muffled voices that she recognized as their guards. She groaned, irritated, attempting to find a more comfortable position on the fur that each one of her friends received for the nights. Astrid turned around, facing the cell's entrance with her back, and attempted to force herself to go to sleep, despite the voices outside the door. Although it was still relatively early, some of her friends were already asleep. Fishlegs and Gobber were snoring slightly, though it wasn't an irritating sound. If anything, it was somewhat reassuring. Snotlout was barely keeping it together. Her future husband was cursing every single person on Dreeke, especially Hiccup. Riddery, Astrid corrected herself. She trembled slightly under the thin blanket, though cold had nothing to do with it. Her mind was filled with pictures of Stoic's son cutting open that man's back, providing him with his own pair of wings. Bloody wings. Astrid trembled again. That was when she first thought that the chief of Dreeke wasn't Hiccup, despite their resemblance. She couldn't have imagined anything that could have occurred during the past 10 years that had changed the boy from Berk so much. It took her a second to realize that she had never truly known him. Despite the time they've spent together during the training and her first flight on the back of a dragon, Astrid had never truly known Stoic's son. And when she thought that her assumption that Riddery and Hiccup were one and the same person was incorrect, Gobber confirmed that the chief of Dreeke was indeed Stoic's long-lost son. The old blacksmith's words were the first thing that resulted in Astrid sharing Snotlout's feelings, namely hatred towards the man who kept them as their prisoners. She wanted to punch him so badly. More than punch him, actually, tear him apart, limb by limb, then put him together again, and repeat the process. He deserved it. He deserved it more than Snotlout did each time he walked away from Astrid with a new bruise. Hiccup would deserve each and every ounce of pain that she could inflict upon him. The shield maiden huffed angrily, still lying helplessly in the makeshift bed, recalling the last time she saw Stoic's son on Berk. "Give me until tomorrow," his voice repeated in her mind, causing her to scowl and turn around to lie on her back. Astrid should have known better that day. She should have made sure that he would return with her to Berk instead of leaving him alone with the dragon. After all, it was his intention to run away when she had faced him in that cove. Hiccup lied to her, and Astrid wasn't the person that would forget it easily. She turned her head left when she heard that the door to the prison had been opened. She groaned in annoyance again, cursing the guards who refused to let them sleep peacefully. One of them, Steinar, Astrid recalled the name, approached the cell that served as their home, carrying a torch in his hand. The bright flame caused her to squint immediately. She heard Stoic, Snotlout, and the twins groan as well, casting daggers with their eyes at the person who refused to leave them alone. "You," he said, pointing his finger at Astrid. "Up," he ordered, approaching the cell's door. Astrid looked at him questioningly, not moving a single muscle. "Get up," he repeated, opening the bars. "Our chief wants to speak to you." Astrid stood up immediately, feeling the blood escaping from her face. Of course, Gobber had told her that he informed Hiccup about her intention of speaking to him in person, but she didn't expect it to happen that quickly. She heard Stoic and Snotlout protesting loudly, causing Gobber and Fishlegs to wake up and groan heavily as well. Astrid's chief and her betrothed moved simultaneously to stop her from leaving the cell, though the guards that were accompanying Steinar acted quickly, forbidding them to move forward. Both men found themselves with spears pointed right at their throats. It immobilized them instantly, though it didn't cause them to stop voicing their objections. Astrid couldn't blame them, though. The last time the guards have come for them during the night, they were taken to witness the birth of the Blood Eagle. Astrid shuddered slightly, though she tried to hide it. Despite what Gobber had told her about Hiccup still being Hiccup, she wasn't entirely sure if she would be speaking to Stoic's son or Riddery. She did her best to make the mental picture of Hiccup's face covered with white and red paint escape her mind. It wasn't time to show fear. "What does he want?" she asked Steinar, grateful that her voice didn't fail her at that moment. The man smiled wickedly at her. "I don't know," he replied with a voice that sent shivers down Astrid's spine. "But don't worry. I doubt he would want to damage that pretty face of yours," he added, his grin widened. Astrid's face paled more, if that was even possible, as the man's suggestion crawled into her mind like a worm. Only then did she truly realize that Hiccup sent for her in the middle of the night, summoning her to his own house. Astrid tried to push away yet another image that her mind came up with, him taking advantage of her. She tried to reassure herself that Hiccup wasn't that kind of man. There again, she had never assumed that she would see him performing the Blood Eagle. She truly didn't know what kind of person was the man who introduced himself to them as Riddery. Urged on by Steinar, she left the cell, not fully aware of her legs' movements nor Snotlout's screams, who ordered them to leave her alone. Astrid didn't register the moment when they've left the prison. Her mind was still filled entirely with a picture of her bent over Hiccup's table with him behind her, her skirt and leggings pulled down to her feet. She was escorted through the sleeping village of Driki by Steinar. The man was holding the torch in one hand and the sword in another one, occasionally pushing her with the flat side of the weapon when Astrid's steps would become slower. Her hands were cuffed in front of her, making it impossible for the young shield maiden to protect herself. She could only huff angrily and glare at the guard, though he only laughed at her. He led her all the way up towards the cliff where the chief's house was. Astrid lifted her head to look at the black shape of Hiccup's hut. She ducked, instinctively, when something flew above her. It took her a few seconds to recognize the shape of a deadly nadder. The dragon squawked in the air before landing on the roof of one of the houses. Astrid heard Steinar chuckling behind her. After what seemed like hours and seconds at the same time, they've reached the entrance of Hiccup's household. Through the cracks between the wooden planks, Astrid could see the light coming from the inside. She walked up the stairs, standing on the patio, not daring to make a single step forward. Steinar passed her by and knocked at the door. After a few seconds of silence, a voice from the inside told them to go in. The man opened the door, urging Astrid to enter the house. When she still didn't move, the guard pushed her with the flat side of his sword once again. She couldn't help but yelp when she had been forced to go inside. Astrid felt her cheeks burning. She never yelped. The first thing she had noticed after entering the house was smoke. Slate blue waves were filling the interior, forcing their ways into Astrid's lungs, causing her to cough slightly to get rid of them. She was surprised when she realized that it wasn't the usual aroma of burning wood, or anything burning, to be precise. Astrid sniffed cautiously, realizing that the smoke had a somewhat sweet aroma, although a little bitter as well. "Unchain her," Steinar, the same voice that told them to go in, said. Astrid looked up, abruptly stopping her contemplation about the smoke's origins. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't see anyone beyond the veil of the slate blue cloud. Astrid heard footsteps from the house's interior and then a scratching of wood against wood, followed almost immediately by a cool breeze. Astrid more felt than saw Steinar approaching her, taking off the chains from her hands. She massaged her wrists absent-mindedly, casting daggers with her eyes at the guard. "Leave us," the voice said as the smoke began to clear out. "Are you sure, Chief?" Steinar asked uncertainly, causing Astrid to smirk slightly. "Yeah. I'll call for you when we're done," the voice replied, and Astrid's smirk instantly vanished from her face. Her mind had once again been filled with the images it has produced earlier. "Wait outside," the voice added. She noticed with the corner of her eye that Steinar gave a simple nod, seemingly able to see through the slate blue cloud, and turned around to leave the house, closing the door behind him. "Sorry about the smoke," the voice said when they were alone. I tend to forget myself a little sometimes," the man explained, and Astrid began to make out the contour of his body, outlined by a gentle light of the fire from the hearth. Even if she knew that it had to be Hiccup, it was still impossible to call that man with that name when she couldn't see him. Or hit him. It didn't take long before the smoke evaporated from the room, though that moment was filled with an uncomfortable silence that caused the time to stretch unbearably. Astrid immediately noticed a black, curled-up shaped nest to the chief of Driki. It took her less than a blink of an eye to recognize it as Toothless. The Night Fury was watching her with the same curiosity as the day before, scrutinizing her with its greenish eyes. Astrid quickly directed her gaze from the dragon to its rider. Now that she could see him, she could confirm it was Hiccup, though, at the same time, he wasn't. It was the first moment for Astrid to realize how much he had changed during the past 10 years. Half of his face was covered with a full auburn beard, though it couldn't have been compared to Stoic's. His hair was not falling into his eyes anymore, nor was it messy. It had been arranged into a single braid, something he had changed only recently, she realized, when he summoned everyone to witness the birth of the Blood Eagle. His eyes remained the same as she remembered them, though. The same, forest green orbs that used to follow her every movement when they were teens on Berk. Astrid blinked a few times in surprise when she noticed uncertainty and something that resembled uneasiness in them. It caused the lump in her throat, that she hadn't been aware of until now, to loosen up a little. Perhaps Gobber was right. Maybe he hadn't changed that much after all. Even though he had changed a lot, Astrid noticed as she examined his posture. There was no trace of his usually slouched shoulders, and he had grown much, both tall and broad. Still, he couldn't even begin to compare to an average Viking from Berk, even to Snotlout, but she had no doubt that he was much stronger than his lean posture would suggest. Hiccup wore a red woolen tunic that seemed to be a little too big for him and brown leather breeches that were ended with a pair of fur boots on his feet. Astrid quickly noticed a strange object in Hiccup's hand that seemed to be made out of wood. She caught a small flash of something burning before the man in front of her raised his left hand, directing the thing he was holding to his lips. Astrid watched with astonishment in her eyes as Hiccup breathed in deeply. If the sudden widening of his ribcage was any indication, her eyes widened even more when she saw him breathing out the smoke that used to fill the room a few minutes prior. Like a dragon, she commented in her thoughts. Astrid Hiccup acknowledged her, and the uncertainty of his gaze was the same in his voice. It took Astrid a few seconds to realize that she was just standing there, staring at the man she used to know, without saying a single word. She had somehow managed to fight off the blush that threatened to creep up her cheeks. "It's you," she murmured, taking a careful step forward. Hiccup was just standing there, not daring to make a single move as the blonde in front of him was getting closer and closer. He was only bringing the wooden object up from time to time, exhaling smoke. She reached out with her hand when she was close enough, gently brushing her fingers against Hiccup's shoulder as if she wanted to make sure that he was really standing there and her mind wasn't playing tricks on her. The man in front of her gulped loudly, dropping his gaze to look at her hand. "It's really you," she added, echoing Gobber's words. Hiccup didn't even have time to marvel at her touch before a sudden feeling, as if someone ripped his arm away from his torso, overwhelmed his senses. He yelled, both out of surprise and pain that erupted in his shoulder. The sudden sensation caused him to drop the wooden object he was still holding. It clattered on the ground, scattering its content. Hiccup cursed silently, bending down to pick it up instantly. He stomped a few times on the still-burning content before it could cause any serious damage to the floor of his house. "Was that really necessary?" Hiccup asked, rubbing the sore spot on his shoulder. He was staring at her with wide eyes as if he was pleading with her not to continue the onslaught. Astrid's hand was still outstretched as if she didn't fully register what she had just done. She couldn't stop the warm feeling that nestled in her chest. It felt better than she thought it might. The door to the house was opened by Steinar, who walked in immediately after hearing Hiccup's scream, his sword drawn, ready to be used against the attacker. "It's all right," Hiccup said instantly after noticing the guard entering his house. "I'll handle it. Now leave," he added, using his head to point at the door. Steinar turned around to leave, although reluctantly, and closed the door behind him. "Was that necessary?" He repeated the question, still staring at Astrid with wide eyes. "Sorry," she mumbled, almost incoherently. "I just wanted to make sure that it's you," she clarified, blinking a few times. She hauled off and punched him again at the same spot, though her blow was much stronger this time. Hiccup groaned, already feeling the bruise that was beginning to appear on his shoulder. "And that?" he asked after taking in a few shaky breaths. With each second, Astrid's anger was rising steadily, replacing the fear that she felt when Steinar was escorting her to Hiccup's house. "For being gone for 10 years," she answered. As soon as the words left her mouth, she punched him again, her target remaining the same. Hiccup groaned heavily again. "And that's for imprisoning us," Astrid said, hauling off again. This time, though, Hiccup had managed to catch her fist with his right hand, not allowing her to inflict more pain on his already sore shoulder. Unfortunately for him, he failed to stop her from punching him once again, as she used her left arm to hit his stomach. "Are you just going to sit there and allow her to do that?" Hiccup asked after groaning once again. Toothless let out a sound that resembled laughter. The Night Fury remained in its spot, observing the spectacle in front of it. "So much for dragon loyalty," Hiccup commented, looking at Astrid once again, moving away just in time to avoid another punch that was supposed to make contact with his face. "So that's why you've wanted to meet with me? To beat me to death?" Perhaps Astrid replied, seething with anger. Now get back here, Hiccup, she said when he moved away once again. I'm not done with you yet. I would appreciate it if you could keep it quiet, Hiccup countered. My daughter is asleep, and I would be most displeased if you woke her up, he added, avoiding yet another blow that was directed at his abdomen. I don't give two shits about it, Astrid replied, still trying to hit him again, much to Toothless' amusement. The black dragon was following with its eyes the strange dance its rider and the female seemed to perform. But I do, Hiccup countered, surprising Astrid when he caught both of her arms, gripping them tightly. The young shield maiden was squirming, trying to release herself from his hold. Hiccup only clenched his fingers tighter on her wrists. He ignored the sharp pain that erupted in his foot when Astrid abruptly stomped on it. He groaned again, twisting her arms so she would stop fighting against him. It was her turn to groan, although she did her best to suppress it. Let me go, Astrid hissed at him, even attempting to bite his fingers. Not before you calm down, Hiccup replied, panting slightly. He was still holding her wrists firmly, keeping her in an iron grip. They were locked in a staring contest, challenging each other to see who would last longer. Her azure eyes were casting daggers against his peaceful emerald ones. Allowing himself to cheat a little, Hiccup increased the strength of his grip, causing Astrid to squint and hiss slightly. She also stopped fighting against his hold. Now, that wasn't so difficult, he commented when her anger seemed to evaporate a little. Hesitantly, Hiccup dropped her hands, allowing Astrid to regain control over her arms. He had no one to blame but himself when her fist made contact with his shoulder once again. He rubbed the sore spot once again, sighing heavily, though this time it was caused by annoyance rather than pain. They both were panting heavily, and Astrid's eyes were still filled with hatred. If looks could kill, Hiccup would have been long dead. He answered her gaze with his own tired one, sighing heavily. After a few seconds of just staring at each other, Hiccup took a step backward, heading towards the table. It was his turn to admit defeat in their battle of gazes. He slumped on one of the chairs, leaning against the backrest. Astrid watched as he opened a small pouch that was lying on the wooden slab, pulling out a small handful of what looked to be dried leaves. Hiccup placed them in the small object he was still holding in his left hand, gesturing to her to sit down as well. Although a little reluctantly, Astrid complied, taking a seat at the opposite end of the table. Her eyes were still casting daggers at him, and she had been rewarded with a small shiver that went down Hiccup's spine. He didn't even try to hide it. Want something to drink? He offered, igniting the dried leaves with a flint. I have no ale, but I can brew you some tea if you want, he added, inhaling deeply from the wooden object. After a few seconds, he let out yet another cloud of smoke. What's tea? Astrid asked, not sure what else she could say at that moment. Hiccup shrugged his shoulders. A warm drink made out of dried plants, he explained, standing up from his chair. Astrid followed his every movement with her eyes, observing silently, as he approached a large barrel filled with water. He put a small jug in it, filling it up with the liquid. He placed the small dish over the hearth, allowing the water to warm up and, eventually, boil. I must say it can work miracles, he added, taking out 2 cups and placing them next to the hearth. It's much better than a mulled ale when it comes to keeping you warm, and it's much more gentle for your stomach than the alcohol, he explained, throwing in a few dried plants into both of the cups. Every now and then, he would inhale from the wooden object and let out a cloud of smoke. Although it's bitter, he added after a moment of silence. Astrid didn't say anything as Hiccup continued working next to the hearth. It took him a few minutes to return to the table with 2 cups in his hands. The wooden object was resting between his teeth as he placed the 2 drinks on the slab. Astrid watched, warily, the cup he put in front of her. Steam was rising from it, mixing with the smoke Hiccup was creating. Hesitantly, she reached out for the cup, sniffing the liquid. She was surprised when she smelled nothing, just warmth. Astrid allowed herself to take a careful sip of the drink, but not before she was sure that Hiccup drank it as well. Bitter, she confirmed with a subtle nod of her head. Hiccup stood up again and approached one of the lockers that were standing next to the hearth. He has been searching for something for a few minutes before he straightened himself back up with a quiet victorious exclaim. Astrid noticed that he was holding a jar filled with golden brown stuff. He returned to the table, picking up a small spoon, and placed both things in front of Astrid. She eyed it cautiously. Relax, it's just honey, Hiccup informed her, noticing her distrust. He couldn't help but chuckle at that. Do you really think so low of me that you would assume that I'd try to drug you? He asked, taking a sip from his cup, followed by another cloud of smoke. I don't know, Astrid replied, also drinking from her own cup after adding 2 tablespoons of honey to her drink. It tasted much better than it used to. Can't say I've ever known you back on Berk, she admitted. And from what I've seen 2 nights before, you're not the same boy you used to be, she added, referring to the Blood Eagle. Hiccup closed his eyes and sighed heavily, reluctantly recalling the unpleasant memories. Besides, Gobber has told me about your conquests during your travels, Astrid said venomously. The young man lifted his eyelids, staring at her with a surprised look. I wasn't the conqueror, Hiccup replied. It's fair to say that I was the prey, he added. Astrid huffed at that, crossing her arms on her chest. It must have felt terrible, right, she countered. You must have felt awfully with yourself each time. To have all these women throwing themselves at you, Astrid said with an exaggerated sigh. So forgive me if I don't trust you completely, she added, her tone becoming hateful once again. Even if, I've never felt nearly as bad as I have each day on Berk ever since I could remember, Hiccup replied, doing his best to keep his voice low. His words seemed to take Astrid by surprise, if a sudden blush on her cheeks was any indication. Until I've met Toothless, of course, Hiccup added, switching his gaze from the Shield Maiden to the Night Fury. The dragon purred happily after hearing its name, causing Hiccup's lips to curl up in a smile. But I'm not that kind of a man who would take advantage of a woman, he continued, redirecting his gaze to look at Astrid once again. But enough about me and my conquests, Hiccup said, mocking Astrid's tone. Gobber told me you wanted to speak to me. By the time your man was leading me here, I've mostly wanted just to hit you, Astrid replied, earning herself a chuckle from Hiccup. I remember that the last time you've punched me, it was followed by a kiss, Hiccup replied with a smirk. He couldn't help but feel the heat on his left cheek where Astrid's lips made contact with his skin 10 years prior. Will I get one now as well, he asked teasingly, smirking from above the cup of tea. The young Shield Maiden's anger was returning with full strength with each passing second. She wanted nothing more than to punch that smirk off of his lips. You can easily earn yourself another hit, she hissed at him. Maybe next time then, Hiccup countered with a small chuckle. So, that's all you've wanted? To beat me, he asked, exhaling another cloud of smoke. Astrid coughed slightly when some of it reached her, forcing its way into her lungs. Sorry, Hiccup apologized immediately, directing another layer of smoke to the side, making sure that it wouldn't reach Astrid. She had to admit that she was once again surprised by his words. It helps me to relax, he explained. What even is that thing? Astrid queried, motioning at the wooden object Hiccup was holding. Another one of my brilliant inventions, he replied sarcastically. Astrid couldn't help but roll her eyes after hearing the same familiar tone in his voice. Another 10 years could have passed, and she doubted she would have forgotten it. In the south, people tend to burn some herbs during rituals and inhale the smoke. I took it a step further one night, when I was drunk, thinking what would it feel like if I could actually bring in the entire smoke directly inside me, he explained, scrutinizing the wooden object. Turns out I've created an incredible way of relaxing myself and worsening the aftermath of a heavy binge drinking, he added with a chuckle. Ale tends to hit twice as hard if I combine it with this, he explained, gesturing at the object in his left hand. No matter how hard she tried, Astrid couldn't stop the small chuckle that escaped her lips. She closed her mouth immediately, though it failed to escape Hiccup's attention. He smirked again, causing her blush to increase. Astrid's cheeks felt as if they were on fire. Still, there has to be a reason why you wanted to punch me so badly, Hiccup said after a moment of uncomfortable, at least for Astrid, silence. I've told you the reasons already, she replied, grateful that the blush has escaped from her cheeks. Hiccup huffed at that, inhaling deeply once again. After the second punch, you've said that it was because I've been gone for 10 years, he commented after a few seconds of holding the smoke in his mouth. He slowly released it in a form of small circles. Toothless, even though he's been quiet, blew out his own circles of smoke from his nose, directing them at those that Hiccup has created. Both adults watched as the rings mixed together. Hiccup chuckled slightly, and Astrid had to admit to herself that she found the situation somewhat amusing. There it was, the unholy offspring of lightning and death itself, playing with its own smoke. "If I didn't know better, I'd say you missed me," he added teasingly, causing her to roll her eyes. "So," he asked, urging her to explain. "Do you remember anything else from that evening?" she asked him, arms still crossed firmly on her chest. "Other than me punching you and kissing your cheek," she clarified, fighting against the blush that threatened to take over her face. "Quite a lot, actually," Hiccup replied, shrugging his shoulders. "I remember how you've ambushed me in that cove, how you were holding me tightly when Toothless was trying to kill us," he trotted out, earning himself a low growl from the Night Fury. "And I remember how we've discovered the nest," he practically whispered the last sentence. "And do you remember what you have promised me?" she asked him with a sigh. "How you've said that you would figure something out before the next day." Astrid explained when she saw nothing but a puzzled expression on his face. "And I did," he replied simply. Astrid huffed again, shaking her head in disbelief. She lifted the cup to her lips to find an excuse for her hands from strangling him there and then. "Running away was your idea of finding a solution?" she asked, scowling at him. "Actually, yes," he answered with another shrug. "I've done what was best not only for me but for the entire village," Hiccup explained before Astrid could say something. "I've got rid of Berk's greatest nuisance and the worst Viking they have ever seen," he continued, silencing her effectively. "I've saved you all from all the damage I could have possibly done by staying, and I've relieved everyone from the prospect of me becoming their chief. So yeah, I've found a perfect solution." "I thought you meant something else when you've said that you'll think about it," Astrid replied, refusing to be silenced by his words for long. "I thought that you would do something utterly stupid and unbelievably crazy and use what you have learned from that Night Fury," she said, gesturing at Toothless. The dragon looked at her questioningly. "And who would have listened?" Hiccup snapped at her. "My father. He never listened to me, no one on Berk ever listened to me." "I did," Astrid countered quietly, causing the man in front of her to huff as he was taking another sip from his own cup. "I had to throw you on a tree before you've allowed me to explain anything," Hiccup commented. "I doubt I would be able to do that with everyone on Berk. Besides, you could have shown everyone the truth about the dragons as well. You could have shown what you have learned from me. And what difference would it have made?" Astrid asked, not believing that he was throwing accusations at her. "He had no right to do that." "Exactly," Hiccup murmured against the edge of his cup. "No, I mean, why would it be any different if that was me and not you?" she clarified. "Okay, I get it, and I admit it, that people didn't listen to you, but you could have shown them what you have shown me." "No, I couldn't," he countered. Astrid huffed again. "Why?" she queried, looking at him. Hiccup was avoiding her gaze, directing his gaze at everything but not her. "Why do you think that it would have been better if I did that?" "Because you've never been," Hiccup the useless, he snapped at her angrily, once again silencing Astrid effectively. She opened and closed her mouth a few times, but no sound has managed to come out of her. She watched as Hiccup bit on his lower lip anxiously. "What?" "No smart answer to that one." "Well, let me tell you this because I don't think you're fully aware of what it looked like to grow up on Berk from my perspective." "Of course, how could you have known?" he snorted again with a humorless chuckle. "You were the great Astrid Horfason, the best warrior of our generation, the Viking prodigy," Hiccup trotted out mockingly. "While I was a walking toothpick, a disgrace to my father and to the Haddock family as a whole," he added, still biting his lip nervously. "Do you have the slightest idea just how many times I've heard behind my back comments like 'poor Stoic, the gods must hate him,' or 'it's not fair that Valka has been taken away when she gave him only this'? You never had to try to earn your parents' love, but I did. You never had to try to prove yourself as worthy to the village, I had to. So do you really believe that if I had tried to show people on Berk what I had learned about the dragons, they would have listened to me?" "I highly doubt that," he added before Astrid could even formulate a response. She could only watch as he took in a shaky breath, attempting to calm himself down. It was quickly followed by another cloud of smoke escaping from his mouth. "So I did what everyone was waiting for me to do," he continued, though his voice lacked its previous agitation. "I've left." "He missed you," Astrid whispered after a few minutes of silence. Your father, I mean, she clarified when she noticed his puzzled expression. Hiccup snorted again, shaking his head. He didn't miss me, he contradicted. He missed the idea of finally having the perfect son he had always hoped to have, Hiccup explained. The night before Gothai chose me as the champion, he called me the worst Viking Burke has ever known, he said, looking down at his cup. He stirred it a few times, watching the herbs move inside slowly. He missed you, Astrid repeated, this time firmer. He believes you had been killed by a dragon, Hiccup. He thinks that they took you away, as they did his wife, because you've suddenly become so good in the arena, she told him. Hiccup snorted again. I know, he replied. Gobber has already told me that. So if he believes that, I'm not going to disappoint him again by crushing his concept that his only son has died like a true Viking. I've disappointed him enough in my life already. Whatever Astrid wanted to say was interrupted by a quiet creaking of the door. Both adults turned their heads towards the place from which the sound came. Right at the entrance to the main room was standing Zephyr, still groggy from her short sleep. The small girl rubbed her eyes, blinking a few times. Astrid's lips curled up in a small smile when she noticed a stuffed toy the child was holding, a miniature Night Fury. Zephyr, why aren't you sleeping? Hiccup asked, standing up from his seat once again. I've heard you were talking to someone, and I wanted to see, Daddy, she replied, lifting her small hands high into the air. Wordlessly, Hiccup fulfilled her request by picking her up and bringing her to his chest. Astrid observed with a slight bemusement the interaction between them. She had seen Hiccup's daughter before, but it was always from a distance. Suddenly, she felt like an intruder, which she was, she realized after a second. She more heard than saw Hiccup sitting back in his chair. Are you my mommy? The small girl asked when she noticed another person in the room. Astrid's eyes widened after hearing the question. She's not, sweetheart, Hiccup answered before Astrid managed to formulate a response. Although she didn't know why, the young shield maiden felt her heart shattering into 1,000 pieces when she saw the small smile fading away from Zephyr's lips. Only then did she remember that Gobber said that Hiccup was a widower. I hoped she returned, the little girl murmured, hiding her face in Hiccup's chest. Astrid watched as his expression darkened visibly, followed by a silent sigh. She will, one day, he replied, pressing his lips into her hair. He was swaying gently in the chair, attempting to put her back to sleep. Who is she? Zephyr asked after pulling her head slightly away from Hiccup's chest. She's an old friend of mine. Like the one from the forge? Yes, like the one from the forge, Hiccup replied with a small smile, caressing the girl's cheek. But she hasn't been told to hurt you, right? Zephyr asked, looking at him questioningly. I think not, he answered, looking Astrid straight into the eyes from behind the girl's hair. Go back to sleep, darling, Hiccup muttered into her head, placing there a soft kiss. The two adults were sitting in silence for a few minutes, waiting for Hiccup's swaying to work its magic on the little girl. Astrid managed only to stare with a heavy heart. She didn't know what it felt like not to have a mother, but she couldn't help but feel sympathy towards the little girl and the young father. All anger she was holding against Hiccup seemed to evaporate instantly, as she was witnessing the affectionate interaction between the two. Her mind was quickly filled with the pictures of herself in a similar situation, nursing Snotlout's children. She wondered for a few seconds if she would ever be able to give them the same love that Hiccup had for his daughter. She doubted it. You're still wearing your crowns, and Hiccup whispered quietly, careful not to disturb his daughter's sleep. Astrid blinked a few times in surprise. There wasn't anyone to remove it yet, she replied, once again crossing her arms on her chest. Hiccup's comment made her touch the leather band on her head, and her eyes were drawn to the similar one Zephyr was wearing. There will be soon, from what I've heard, he whispered back, earning himself a displeased groan from the young shield maiden. Don't remind me, she sighed heavily, massaging her temples. You're not happy? Hiccup asked her, looking away from his daughter. The young girl shifted slightly in his embrace but didn't wake up. I thought marriage was supposed to bring joy, he added. And did it in your case? Astrid asked before she managed to bite her tongue. She noticed Hiccup going stiff immediately, straightening in his chair. By the movements of his jaw beneath the beard, she assumed that he gritted his teeth tightly. I'm sorry, It's okay, Hiccup stopped her in mid-sentence. And while it's difficult sometimes, I wouldn't change anything, he whispered, observing Zephyr, who was hugging his chest tightly. I still have my little sweetheart, he added, and Astrid could swear that she noticed a tear in the corner of his eye. He blinked a few times to get rid of it. And how did you know? Hiccup asked after a moment of silence. Gobber said you're a widower, Astrid informed him, suddenly ashamed that she learned such a piece of private information from someone else than Hiccup. Did he now? How did she? I mean, how did your wife die? Hiccup suggested. Astrid nodded, not finding the strength to say that word. She was in a nearby village with Zephyr, roughly 3 hours of flight from here, he said, placing another kiss on top of his daughter's head. He felt her smile into his chest. That village was attacked by Dager and his berserkers.